these long, gentle tales bring you rest, you may wish to subscribe, so more of them can quietly find you on the nights to come. And if you feel like it, you might leave a comment telling us how many nights you have fallen asleep to these gentle stories, for it is always lovely to know that you are there. There is no hurry in that, and nothing you must do now. Only let the thoughts settle softly, the way dust settles on a still evening, and then let it go. Tonight, we are going to follow one whole life, slowly and from the very beginning, the life of Paul Atreides, a boy born to a great and ancient house who would live to be called a god upon a world of endless sand. We will begin far from the desert, on a green world washed by rain and ocean, in the old stone castle of his family, where a child is born beneath a gray and gentle sky. From there, we will walk with him, unhurried, through everything that a life can hold, through boyhood and learning, through loss and long wandering, through love and war and quiet, and at last through an ending that folds him back into the sand he came to love. So settle in now, and let your shoulders soften. Let the room around you grow dim and warm. Let the weight of the day slide from you like water running back to the sea. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing here to fear. Only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you gently towards sleep. Over the next 20 chapters, we will move without haste through his birth on the ocean world of Caladan and the tender years of his childhood, through the secret teachings of his mother and the trials that would test whether he was truly human, through the disciplines of the mind and the lessons of the blade. We will follow him to the burning desert planet called Arrakis, through the fall of his house and the long flight into the deep desert, into the hidden homes of the Fremen and the sacred trance of the water of life, through his rise as the one they named Muad'Dib, through his victory and his throne, through the great fire that carried his name across the stars, through the quiet love at the center of it all, and through the last lonely walk that carried him out of history and into legend. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to follow every name or hold every thread. Let the story move through you like a slow tide across warm sand, rising and falling, asking nothing of you at all. Let each gentle word loosen you a little further from the waking world, and when your eyes grow heavy, let them close, and let the telling carry you the rest of the way down, softly, into rest. Far out among the older worlds of the known universe, on a planet of rain and ocean called Caladan, a child was born who would one day be spoken of as more than a man, though on the night of his birth he was only a small warm weight held close in the dim quiet of a stone room. The world he was born into was a green and gentle world, a place of long gray rains and slow tides, of cliffs that dropped down into a restless sea, and of mists that rolled in soft and cool over fields worked by patient hands. There was water everywhere on Caladan, water in the sky, and water in the wells, and water thundering forever against the black rocks below the castle walls. And the sound of it was the first sound the child ever knew, the deep and steady breathing of the ocean that would hush him through the earliest nights of his life. His name was Paul, and he was the son and heir of the Duke Leto of the House Atreides, an old and honorable family whose banner carried the red hawk and whose name went back through many centuries of loyalty and pride. Castle Caladan was their seat, a great pile of dark stone worn smooth by the weather of 10,000 years, its towers standing against the wind, its halls hung with the trophies and the portraits of the long line that had come before. In one of those halls there hung the mounted head of an old bull, a black and glaring thing, and near it a painting of a man with dark, sad eyes. And though the child could not yet know their meaning, these were the quiet ghosts of the family into which he had been carried, the grandfather who had died, and the beast that had killed him, kept there so that no Atreides would ever forget the cost of courage. The Duke, his father, was a man who ruled with a rare and difficult thing, which was love. He governed his people with honor rather than fear, and they gave him in return a loyalty that no threat could have purchased and no coin could have bought. He walked among the folk of the fishing villages and the Pundi rice fields. He knew the names of the men who flew for him and fought for him, and he carried always in his bearing a kind of grave tenderness, the look of a man who understood that power was a burden held in trust and not a prize to be spent. Even in the great affairs of state, in the long dangerous games played among the noble houses of the Imperium, Leto tried to hold to the plain old virtues, and though this made him beloved, it also made him vulnerable in a universe where such virtues were rare and where those who lacked them watched the House Atreides with cold and patient envy. The mother of the child was the Lady Jessica, a woman of quiet grace and hidden depth, tall and calm and possessed of a stillness that drew every eye in a room without ever seeming to ask for it. She was the bound concubine of the Duke and not his wife, for reasons that lay tangled in the politics of the great houses. Yet, she loved him with a fierce and settled devotion, and he loved her in return, and between them there was a bond deeper than any marriage of alliance could have made. But the Lady Jessica carried a secret woven all through her, for she was a daughter of the Bene Gesserit, that ancient and secretive sisterhood of women who trained their bodies and their minds to powers that ordinary people could scarcely believe, and who moved unseen through the courts of the Imperium, guiding the bloodlines of the noble houses toward some long and hidden purpose of their own. The sisterhood had given the Lady Jessica to the Duke, and they had commanded her, as they commanded all their daughters, to bear only a girl child, a daughter who could be wed into the enemy line and so heal an old and bitter feud within their secret breeding plan. That was the promise she had been bound to keep. Yet she had looked upon the man she loved, and she had known how deeply he longed for a son to carry his name and his house forward. And out of that love, she had made a choice that was hers alone to make and hers alone to answer for. She had set aside the command of the sisterhood, and she had borne him a son, and in doing so, she had bent the long design of her order and stepped off the careful path that had been laid for her, not knowing and unable to know how far the ripples of that single tender defiance would one day travel. And so the child Paul came into the world carrying more than most children carry, though for now it was carried lightly and unknowing, the way a small sleeping thing knows nothing of its own weight. He carried the hopes of a great and ancient house, the whole long line of the Atreides, gathered up and set upon his small shoulders, the expectation that he would grow to be Duke in his turn and rule with the same honor his father had shown. He carried in his blood the disciplines and the hidden potential of the Bene Gesserit, passed to him through his mother, against every rule and every caution of her order. And he carried, though no one yet could see it, the faint first stirrings of something the universe had been reaching toward for longer than anyone could remember, a promise folded so deep inside him that even he would not feel it for many years. But none of that showed on the night of his birth. On that night, there was only the warm room in the old stone castle, and the low glow of the lights turned down soft, and the loyal household keeping their quiet watch beyond the door. The servants and the soldiers and the old retainers who had served the family through the years, and who now waited to learn whether the house would have its heir. There was the sound of the sea outside, rising and falling against the rocks, that patient, endless breathing that had rocked the sleep of every Atreides born in that place. There was the Duke, standing at the window looking out over the dark water, his heart full past speaking. And there was the Lady Jessica, worn and gentle and quietly glad, holding the small new life against her, feeling the little heartbeat flutter against her own, and looking down at the tiny face with an emotion too large and too tender to be given any single name. Outside, the gray clouds of Caladan moved slowly across a darkening sky, and the rain came drifting in from the sea as it had always come, soft and cool and unhurried, gathering on the ancient stones and running away in bright thin ribbons down the castle walls. The lamps of the fishing boats made small warm points of light far out on the water, and the tide came in as it had come in for uncounted ages, folding itself again and again upon the shore. Within the thick old walls, safe and dry and warm, the child slept his first sleep in a world that did not yet know his name, breathing softly in the arms of a mother who loved him more than her own life and more than the rules she had broken to give him breath. Let the picture of it settle gently over you now. That quiet green world washed in rain, that old gray castle standing steady above the sea, the low warm room and the small sleeping child held close and safe. There is nothing yet to fear in this beginning. Nothing sharp, nothing hurried, only a life just barely begun in a place of water and stone. Only the tide going out and coming in. Only the soft sound of the rain. Let your own breathing slow to match the rhythm of that far ocean, in and out, rising and falling. And let the warmth of that first quiet night settle down over you like a blanket drawn up in the dark, carrying you softly, easily, gently, down toward your own deep and peaceful rest. The years of Paul's early boyhood passed on Caladan the way the seasons passed there, slowly and softly, wrapped always in the sound of water. He grew from the small sleeping child into a slender, dark-haired boy with his father's grave eyes and his mother's quiet stillness. And he grew up inside the great stone body of Castle Caladan, which was the whole of the world to him then. A world of long corridors and cool high rooms, of worn steps and thick doors and windows that looked out forever upon the sea. The rains came and went and came again, drifting in off the ocean in soft gray sheets, and the boy learned the many voices of that rain, the gentle patter of it on the courtyard stones, the hiss of it against the tall windows, the deep steady drumming of it upon the old roofs in the storms of the wet season. He came to know the sea in all its moods, the sea that lay always at the foot of the cliffs below the castle, sometimes flat and silver and still under a pale sky, sometimes dark and heaving and streaked with white in the wind. He would stand at the high windows and watch the fishing boats go out in the early grayness and come home again at dusk, small and brave upon the wide water, and he would watch the seabirds wheel and cry above the waves. The smell of salt and rain and wet stone was the smell of home to him, folded so deep into his earliest memory that he would carry it with him always, and would one day, in a place of nothing but burning sand, remember the coolness and the green and the endless gentle water of the world where he had been a boy. The castle was full of loyal people, and among them Paul moved, as a child moves, who is loved and watched over. There was the household that served the Duke, the cooks and the guards and the old servants who had grown gray in the service of the Atreides. And there were the great men of his father's court, who would in time become his teachers, though in these earliest years they were simply the strong and familiar faces that surrounded him. He learned early the names and the natures of the people around him, for he was a watchful child, quieter than most, given to long stretches of stillness in which he seemed to be listening to something the others could not hear. He noticed things. He noticed the way a voice would tighten around a lie, the way a person's hands would betray what their face was trying to hide, And though he did not yet understand where this sharpness came from, it was already growing in him, a keenness of attention beyond his years. He learned too the stories of his own line, for the Atreides were an old house and they carried their history the way a family carries an heirloom, carefully and with pride. He heard of the long descent of the family, of the honor they had kept through the centuries, of the wars they had fought, and the loyalties they had held, and the deaths they had died. He learned of his grandfather, the old duke who had died in the bullering for the love of spectacle and courage. And he came to understand, in the slow way that a child understands such things, that to be an Atreides was to carry both a great pride and a great weight, that the name he bore was a gift and also a duty, and that one day the whole of it would come down to rest upon him. And there was, all through those years, a quiet grief and a quiet pride woven together in his parents, so closely joined that the boy could not always tell the one from the other. His father, the Duke, carried the cares of the house upon him like a cloak he never set down. And though he was tender with his son and steady in his love, there was often a shadow behind his eyes, the look of a man who saw dangers gathering that he could not name aloud to a child. His mother, the Lady Jessica, carried her own hidden burdens, the secret of her order and the choice she had made, and the constant watchful care of a woman trained to see far more than she ever showed. Yet both of them looked upon their son with a pride that ran deep and warm beneath the shadow. And the boy grew up held between these two currents, the love and the worry, the pride and the grief, and he took the whole of it in without quite knowing what he took. But there was one thing about the boy that even his careful mother did not fully understand, and it was this. Paul dreamed. He had always dreamed, from as far back as he could remember. Dreams so clear and so strange that they did not feel like the ordinary dreams of childhood, but like memories of a place he had never been. In these dreams, there was no rain and no sea and no green at all. There was instead a vast and open land of sand, an ocean of dunes stretching away golden under a burning sun, and a sky of pale and endless blue. A dryness so complete that it seemed to belong to another life entirely. He dreamed of caverns in rock, of people wrapped in robes with eyes of the deepest blue, of a great and terrible shape moving beneath the sand. And again, through the shifting of these visions, he dreamed of a girl, a slim young woman with dark hair and those same startling blue eyes. A girl he had never met and could not name, and yet somehow already knew, who looked at him across the dreaming sand as though she had been waiting for him a long, long time. He did not always speak of these dreams, for they were too strange and too private, and he did not have the words to say what they were. But sometimes he would wake in the gray Caladan dawn with the dry taste of that other world still in his mouth, and he would lie still in the cool, damp air, listening to the rain and the sea. And he would wonder at the desert that lived somewhere inside his sleeping mind. He did not know then that these were not merely dreams. He did not know that he was a child already touched by a strange and rare gift, a faint reaching forward of the mind toward things not yet come to pass. He knew only that the desert waited for him behind his closed eyes, patient and golden and vast, and that the girl was there, and that the dreams meant something he could not yet read. And so the boy grew, watchful and gentle and quietly marked, in the old stone castle above the sea. His days were full of the ordinary things of a childhood, the lessons and the meals and the games, the long gray rains and the bright brief clearings, the loyal faces of the household and the deep steady love of his mother and his father. His nights were full of the desert. Between the two he moved, a sensitive boy carrying more than he could name, growing slowly toward a life that lay ahead of him like the tide lying beyond the horizon, always coming, never yet arrived. Let yourself rest now in the quiet of those early years, in the safe old castle by the sea, where a watchful child grew up loved and unhurried in the sound of the rain. Let the strangeness of his dreaming desert stay far off and gentle. No threat in it tonight, only a golden warmth at the edge of sleep. Let your thoughts grow soft and slow, the way the mist grows soft over the fields of Caladan at evening, and let the steady breathing of that far gray ocean carry you down, easily and kindly, into your own untroubled rest. Among all the things that shaped the boy Paul in the quiet years on Caladan, none went deeper or reached further than the teachings of his mother. For the Lady Jessica was no ordinary mother, and the things she carried within her were no ordinary inheritance. She was a daughter of the Bene Gesserit, trained since her own girlhood in the disciplines of that ancient sisterhood, schooled in powers of the mind and the body that ran far beyond what most people of the Imperium believed possible. And it was these secret arts, patiently and carefully, that she began to pass on to her son. She did this knowing that she should not. The teachings of the sisterhood were meant for their daughters, guarded closely, given only to women, and to teach them to a boy was to step once more off the path her order had laid for her. Yet she loved him, and she felt the dangers gathering around her house, and she wished to give her son every strength she had to give, and so she taught him what she was never meant to teach. She began with the breath, for the breath was the beginning of everything. She showed him how to draw it slow and deep and steady, how to let it fall away without haste, how to find in the simple rhythm of breathing a doorway into a deeper stillness. And from the breath, she led him into the great discipline of the sisterhood that was called the way of the nerves and the muscles. A training so complete and so exact that a person schooled in it could command every fiber of the body, could quiet a racing heart by will alone, could hold a limb in perfect stillness or move it with perfect speed, could master pain and fear and exhaustion by turning the mind inward upon the flesh and taking hold of it. Under his mother's patient guidance, the boy learned to sit in a stillness so deep that his own pulse grew slow, to relax each part of himself in turn, until the tension drained away like water sinking into sand, to find within his own body a calm so complete that the world outside seemed to fall silent around him. This was the deep calm that lay at the root of all the sisterhood's arts, a stillness of the mind from which everything else grew, and the Lady Jessica taught it to her son with great care, for she knew that a mind untroubled by fear could see clearly where a frightened mind saw nothing at all. She taught him a small quiet saying that the sisterhood used against fear, a litany to be spoken silently within, a turning of the mind that let terror pass through a person and away like wind through an open door, leaving the deep self untouched and still. She taught him to face the things that frightened him and to let them move through him rather than seize him, to watch his own fear the way one might watch a wave rise and break and slide away, and to remain, when it had passed, wholly and calmly himself. This was a gift beyond price, though the boy did not yet know how dearly he would one day need it. Then she taught him to see. For the Bene Gesserit were trained above all in observation, in reading the smallest signs that people gave without knowing they gave them. And Jessica set out to sharpen this watchfulness in her son until it became a second kind of sight. She taught him to read the tone of a voice, to hear beneath the words the tightening or the ease that told whether a thing was true, to catch the faint quaver of a lie or the small hesitation before a hidden thought. She taught him to read the body, the set of the shoulders, the placement of the hands, the flicker of the eyes, the countless tiny movements by which a person betrays what they most wish to conceal. Slowly the boy came to move through the world as though a veil had been lifted from it, seeing the currents of feeling and intention that ran beneath the surface of every meeting, so that he could tell the frightened from the calm, the honest from the false, the loyal heart from the treacherous one. And there was one power she taught him that stood apart from all the others, the most secret and the most feared of the sisterhood's arts, the power they called the voice. This was a way of shaping the sound of a command so exactly, pitching it and turning it so precisely to the one who heard it, that the body of the listener obeyed before the mind could think to refuse. A person schooled in the voice could bend the will of another with a single spoken order, could make a hand fall still, or a step falter, or a guard step aside, simply by the deep and studied craft of how the words were formed. This was a grave and dangerous thing to teach, and Jessica taught it carefully and slowly, watching her son grow into its use, watching him learn to reach out with nothing but his voice and touch the will of another and turn it. It frightened her a little, how quickly he took to it, how naturally the deep command settled into him, as though some part of him had always known how it should be done. There were times, in the long, patient hours of this teaching, when the Lady Jessica would pause and look upon her son with a feeling that was half pride and half something colder, something close to awe. For she saw that he learned more quickly than she had learned, more quickly perhaps than anyone had a right to learn, that the disciplines settled into him as though he had been made for them, that he reached toward the deep places of the sisterhood's knowledge with an ease that no boy and few grown women had ever shown. She had broken the rule of her order to bear a son and to teach him these things, and now, watching him master them one after another, she began to feel the faint stirrings of a question she did not dare to speak aloud, a question about what exactly she had brought into the world and what he might one day become. But she set the question aside, as mothers do, and returned to the teaching, for there was much to give and the days were passing. And so the boy grew in the secret arts, quietly, within the old stone walls above the sea, learning to still his breath and calm his heart, learning to read the truth in a voice and a face, learning the litany against fear and the deep command of the voice, gathering into himself, hour by patient hour, the hidden inheritance of a sisterhood that had never meant a son of theirs to hold it. He did not fully understand what he was becoming. He knew only that his mother's teaching opened doors within him, one after another, into rooms of stillness and clarity and power he had not known were there, and that with each door opened the world grew quieter and clearer around him. Let that clarity and that quiet settle over you now, the deep, still calm that the boy learned at his mother's side, the slow breath drawn and let go, the mind grown smooth and untroubled as still water. There is no danger in this stillness, only rest, only the soft loosening of every held thing, the shoulders easing, the hands opening, the breath falling slow and deep and even. Let the litany of the desert people work its gentle work in you tonight, letting every small fear pass through you and away and leave you calm. And let that deep and studied calm carry you softly, easily, all the way down into your own untroubled sleep. There came a day to Castle Caladan, in the last of Paul's boyhood, that would test him as he had never been tested, and it came in the person of an old woman who arrived from far away. She was a reverend mother of the Bene Gesserit, the most honored rank of that ancient sisterhood, and her name was Gaius Helen Mohiam, and she had come across the great dark of space to look upon the boy her order had not asked for and did not fully understand. She was old and stern and heavy with authority, this woman, and she carried within her the accumulated knowledge and the cold purpose of the sisterhood. And she had come to Caladan for a single grave reason. She had come to test whether the boy was human or whether he was something less, an animal wearing a human shape. And to make that test, she had brought with her two things of ancient and terrible use. The Lady Jessica knew what was coming, and it filled her with a dread she could barely hold beneath her trained composure, for she loved her son, and she knew that the test could kill him. Yet she could not refuse it, for she had already defied her order deeply enough in the bearing and the teaching of him, and to stand between him and the Reverend Mother now was beyond her power. And so, on the appointed morning, the boy was brought into a room where the old woman waited, and his mother was sent to stand apart, and the great doors were closed, and Paul found himself alone before the ancient stranger and the strange objects she had set before her. The first of these was a box, a small, dark box of dull metal, open on one side, and the Reverend Mother told him that he was to place his hand within it and leave it there. The second was a needle she held near his throat, a needle tipped with a poison so deadly that the smallest scratch of it would mean death, and she told him plainly that if he drew his hand from the box before she gave him leave, the needle would find him, and he would die. So he was held between the two, his hand within the dark box and the poisoned point at his neck, and the test began, and the boy understood that he could not withdraw and could not flee, that he could only endure whatever came, or die. At first the box held nothing but darkness and his own still hand. But then there came a warmth, and the warmth grew slowly into heat, and the heat grew slowly into pain. It began as a small burning in his fingers, an itch, a discomfort, and it swelled and deepened until it became a fire, a searing agony that seemed to gnaw at his flesh, that told him with every screaming nerve that his hand was burning, that the skin was crisping and blackening, that the very bones would char to nothing if he did not tear his hand free at once. Every animal instinct within him rose up and howled to snatch the hand away, to escape the fire, to save the flesh from the ruin it felt sure was happening. And there, waiting at his throat, was the poisoned needle, so that to obey that howling instinct was to die. This was the whole of the test, and its cruel heart. For the Reverend Mother had told him a thing that the sisterhood held to be true, which was that an animal caught in a trap will chew off its own leg to escape, will destroy itself in blind panic to flee a present pain, while a human being will hold still, will master the terror and the agony, will endure a lesser suffering now to avoid a greater ruin later, because a human being can see beyond the moment and rule the animal within. The pain in the box was not real damage to his flesh. It was a trick played upon the nerves, an illusion of burning meant to summon up the animal panic and see whether the boy could master it. And so the test was not truly a test of his hand, but of his mind and his will, of whether the human in him could hold the animal still while the fire raged. And here, in the worst of it, the boy reached for the things his mother had given him. He reached for the deep calm she had taught him, for the slow breath and the stilled heart, for the quiet way of turning the mind inward and taking hold of the flesh. He spoke to himself, silently and within, the small litany against fear that he had learned at her side, letting the terror rise and letting it pass through him and letting it drain away, refusing to let it seize him, holding to the still center beneath the storm. The pain did not lessen. It grew and grew until it seemed past all bearing, until every nerve in his hand shrieked that it was being destroyed. And still he held on, breathing slow, his mind clenched around its calm, enduring one more moment, and then one more, and then one more, keeping his hand within the box while the fire told him 1,000 times to flee. How long it lasted he could not have said, for pain stretches time into something long and terrible. But at last the heat began to fade, the fire to cool, the agony to ebb away, and the old woman told him he might take his hand from the box. He drew it out, and it was whole and unmarked. No burn upon it, no wound at all, only the deep memory of a pain that had felt like the end of the world. And the Reverend Mother looked at him with something new in her old stern eyes, something that was not quite belief and was more than surprise. For the boy had endured what few endured, and he had endured a measure of it beyond what she had expected, beyond perhaps what any before him had shown. For she had marked how long he had held, and how deep the pain had gone, and she was troubled and amazed. She had come to see whether he was human, and he had proven himself human past all doubt, and yet in the manner of his proving there was a hint of something more, something that reached beyond the ordinary human measure. The sisterhood had bred toward a hope for long ages, a hope for one who would be more than they had ever made, and the old woman, looking at the unburned hand and the still, pale face of the boy, felt the cold touch of a possibility she had not truly expected to meet in her lifetime. She said little, and she gave nothing away, but the sense of it hung in the closed room. The sense that this child might be more than any who had come before him, that the long design of the sisterhood might be nearing, in him, some ending or beginning it had not foreseen. And Paul, for his part, stood quiet and shaken and whole, holding his unhurt hand, feeling the last echoes of the pain fade out of him, understanding dimly that he had passed through some door that he could not name and could not go back through. He had faced the fire and mastered it. He had proven the human in himself, and somewhere beneath that, too deep for him to reach, the strange promise folded inside him since his birth had stirred a little further toward waking. Let the fire be gone now, wholly gone, no pain left anywhere, only the deep relief of a hard thing endured and finished. Let your own hands lie easy and unhurt. Let the last of any tightness melt away like the fading of that vanished heat. And let the calm return, the slow breath, the quiet heart, the still center that carried the boy through the worst and left him whole. There is nothing left to endure tonight, nothing to hold against, only rest, and let that soft and complete relief carry you gently down, all the way down, into your own deep and peaceful sleep. Among the men who shaped the young Paul in the halls of Castle Caladan, there was one old and formidable figure whose task was to sharpen not the boy's body, but his mind, and his name was Thufir Hawat. He was the master of assassins of House Atreides, the keeper of its secrets and the guardian of its safety, a man who had served the family through 3 generations and who carried in his weathered face and his hooded eyes the weight of a lifetime spent watching for danger. But Thufir Hawat was more than a soldier and more than a spy. He was a mentat, one of that rare and disciplined order of human beings trained to think with a power and a precision that most people could scarcely imagine, and it was as a mentat that he took the boy under his teaching, to make of Paul's mind an instrument such as few in the universe possessed. To understand what a mentat was, and what Thufir set out to make of the boy, it is needful to remember the old shape of the universe into which Paul had been born. Long ages before, in a time half lost to legend, humankind had made thinking machines, computers and mechanical minds to do their reasoning for them, and these machines had grown until they nearly enslaved and destroyed the whole of the human race. In the great uprising that followed, in a war of faith and fury, humankind cast down the thinking machines and forbade them forever, and set in their place a solemn law that no machine should ever again be made in the likeness of a human mind. And so, having thrown away their mechanical calculators, Human beings had to find within themselves the powers they had lost. And out of that need the Mentats were born, human beings trained from childhood to reason and calculate and remember with a scope and a rigor that took the place of the forbidden machines. This was the discipline that Thufir Hawat began to teach the boy, patiently and exactingly, in long hours of quiet work. He taught Paul first to gather, for a mentat is nothing without the raw material of fact, and the raw material of fact must be gathered whole and clean and without distortion. He taught the boy to observe everything and to remember everything, to take in the smallest details of a room or a conversation or a report, and to hold them all in the ordered chambers of his memory, losing nothing, coloring nothing, keeping each fact clear and separate and true. He taught him to distrust the easy assumption and the comfortable guess, to set aside what he wished were true and hold only to what was, to build his understanding upward from the solid ground of things actually known, rather than downward from things merely hoped or feared. Then, upon that foundation of gathered fact, Thufir taught the boy to reason. He taught him to take the countless separate pieces he had gathered and to lay them beside one another, to see the patterns hidden among them, to follow the long chains of cause and consequence from what was known toward what was likely, to weigh one possibility against another, and to reckon, with cold and careful precision, which of many futures the present facts most surely pointed toward. This was the great work of the mentat, to be a computer made of flesh, to take in the endless flood of data that poured through the affairs of a great house and distill from it clear and useful judgment, to say with reasoned confidence what an enemy might do, where a danger might lie, how a tangled matter would most probably unfold. And Thufir taught the boy to do all of this without any machine to help him, using nothing but the trained and ordered power of his own human mind. It was hard and demanding work, and it asked much of the boy, for the mentat discipline is not a gift that comes easily, but a craft ground into a person through long and patient labor. Yet Paul took to it as he had taken to his mother's teaching, quickly and deeply. And old Thufir Hawat watched with a growing and careful interest as the boy's mind unfolded under his hand. For the boy already possessed, from his mother's training, a rare gift of observation, a keenness in reading the world that gave him more and better facts to work with than most students ever gathered. And he possessed as well a deep and settled calm that let him reason without the fog of fear or wish clouding his sight. The two disciplines fitted together in him, the sisterhood's watchfulness and the mentat's logic, each strengthening the other, so that the boy grew swiftly into a thinker of unusual and even startling power. The old mentat did not say much of what he saw, for he was a cautious man and slow to give praise, and there was much in the world that troubled him and kept his mind busy with the dangers gathering about the house he served. But there were moments, watching the boy work through some hard problem, seeing him lay out the facts and follow the reasoning and arrive at a clear conclusion with a swiftness beyond his years, when the old man felt a quiet astonishment. He had trained many minds in his long life, and he knew the ordinary reach of even a gifted student, and he saw that this boy went beyond it, that Paul's mind moved with a clarity and a completeness that Thufir had rarely met even among grown mentats. It gave the old man both pride and a kind of unease, for a mind so keen was a wonderful thing, and also, perhaps, a thing that reached toward places its teachers could not follow. And so, under the guidance of the old master of assassins, the boy's mind was honed into a rare and disciplined instrument, an instrument of pure reason, ordered and exact and immensely powerful. He learned to hold vast stores of fact within him and to draw upon them at will. He learned to think in the cold, clear way of the mentat, weighing and reckoning and projecting, seeing the shapes of likelihood in the tangle of the world. And this power joined itself to the others already growing in him, to the deep calm and the sharp sight and the hidden command that his mother had given, so that the boy of Caladan became, without yet knowing the full meaning of it, a gathering place for disciplines that were rarely, if ever, found together in one person. Something was being assembled in him, mind upon mind, art upon art, though what it was assembling toward not even his teachers could say. For now, though, there was only the quiet work, the long ordered hours in the cool rooms of the castle, the old mentat and the young pupil, the patient sharpening of a young mind into a keen and reasoning blade. There was the discipline and the concentration, and beneath it the steady calm, and around it the familiar walls of home and the endless soft sound of the Caladan rain. The boy learned to think, and the learning settled into him, and he grew a little further toward the man he would become, and the future that waited for him behind his sleeping eyes. Let the ordered quiet of that learning settle over you now, the calm concentration of a mind at rest within itself, all its parts in their places, nothing pressing, nothing pulling, everything laid down in gentle order. You need reckon nothing tonight, and weigh nothing, and remember nothing at all, for the day is done, and its facts may all be set aside. Let the busy calculating part of your own mind grow still and slow, the way the old castle grew still at evening when the lessons were finished and the lamps were dimmed. And let that deep and orderly quiet carry you softly, easily, all the way down into your own untroubled sleep. There were rooms in Castle Caladan given over entirely to the arts of war, and yet in the memory of the boy who trained there, they would always feel less like places of violence than like places of belonging, warm rooms with worn floors and old light, where two men who loved him taught him how to keep himself alive. The first of these men was a broad and battered warrior named Gurney Halleck, a soldier who had come to the Atreides out of long suffering under the Harkonnens, carrying an old grief in his heart and a strange sweetness beside it. For Gurney was not only a fighter, but a maker of songs, a troubadour who kept a 9-string baliset always within reach, and who could turn from the harshness of the drill floor to the gentleness of a tune without ever seeming to change the shape of his soul. Gurney had a scar that ran along his jaw, a vine of dark tissue left by an inkwhip in the years of his captivity, and the boy learned early that the man wore his hardness lightly, the way a person wears a coat against the cold rather than a mask against the world. When Gurney taught, he taught with his whole body, moving the boy's arm to the correct angle, tapping the boy's ankle to widen a stance, pressing a palm flat against the boy's chest to remind him where his balance lived. And when the lessons were done, Gurney would sit against the wall with the baliset across his knees and let the strings speak softly of far places and old sorrows, so that the child grew up believing, without ever needing to be told, that a warrior might also be tender, that strength and music could share one heart, and that the two were not enemies but companions who had simply learned to walk in step. The great matter of those lessons was the body shield, that small humming field of energy that every trained fighter of the age wore like a second skin, a field that turned aside anything that came at it with speed and let pass only what came slowly and with patience. This was the strange law that governed all their fighting, that the fast blow was thrown back and the slow blow slipped through, so that a swordsman had to learn a rhythm no untrained person could feel, the quick feint to test the shield and the slow, careful thrust to find the gap within it, the fast blade and the slow blade woven together into a single flowing habit of the hands. The boy trained against the practice fields, until the shimmer of them was as familiar to him as the shimmer of rain on the castle windows, until his arm knew of its own accord when to hurry and when to wait. And Gurney watched him learn with a fierce and quiet pride that he tried, and often failed, to hide behind his gruffness. There were days when Gurney pushed him hard, when the older man came at him with a real edge and a real weight of intention, wanting the boy to understand that a lesson taken lightly was a lesson that could one day cost a life. And the boy, who was young and sometimes tired and sometimes reluctant, learned that his moods were his own affair, but his readiness was not. That a fighter who waited for the perfect feeling before he lifted his blade would be a dead fighter before he ever found it. This was a hard teaching softly given, folded inside the affection that ran between them like a warm current, and the boy carried it into the marrow of himself, so that even years afterward, when the world had broken and remade him many times over, he would still feel the memory of Gurney's hand correcting his stance, still hear the faint remembered warmth of the balisette drifting through a stone room by the sea. The second of his teachers was a different kind of man, quicker and brighter and easier in his laughter, a swordmaster named Duncan Idaho, whose skill was so complete that it seemed to have passed beyond effort into a kind of grace. Where Gurney taught the boy the weight and the patience of the blade, Duncan taught him its speed and its joy, the sudden turns, the light footwork, the swift reading of another body's intention in the smallest shift of a shoulder or an eye. Duncan moved like water finding its way downhill, without waste and without hesitation, and to spar with him was to feel oneself gently outdistanced again and again by a friend who never once made the boy feel small for being outdistanced. There was a bond between the two of them that went beyond teacher and student, for Duncan had a way of treating the boy as a comrade in the making, rather than a child to be corrected, and the boy loved him for it, with the uncomplicated love that the young give to those who believe in them. Duncan would show him a difficult move slowly, breaking it into its parts, letting the boy fail at it and fail again, without impatience, until at last the whole of it came together in a single clean motion, and the boy felt, for a bright moment, the pure pleasure of a body doing exactly what the mind had asked of it. In those moments, Duncan's face would open into a wide and generous delight, glad not for his own teaching, but for the boy's arriving. And the boy would carry that gladness away with him like a small, warm coal held in cupped hands. Between these two men, the grave and gentle Gurney and the swift and shining Duncan, the boy was shaped into a fighter worthy of the ancient name he bore, learning not only the crossing of blades, but the deeper things that lay beneath it, the reading of another's balance, the patience to wait for the true opening, the calm that must live at the center of all violence, if that violence is ever to be mastered rather than merely obeyed. He learned to move within the humming field of the shield until it was no longer a thing he thought about, but a thing he simply was. And he learned to sense the slow blade and the fast blade in the intentions of others as clearly as he sensed them in his own hands. And through all of it ran a quiet truth that neither man ever spoke aloud, but both of them carried. The truth that they were not only sharpening a weapon, but guarding a life they held dear. That every correction and every drill and every long patient hour on the training floor was in its own way an act of love. A way of saying that this boy mattered, that his survival was worth the whole of their considerable art. The boy did not always understand this while it was happening, for the young rarely do. But somewhere below his understanding it took root, the knowledge that he was cherished by hard men who did not know how to say so except by teaching him, tirelessly, how to stay alive. So the years of the blade passed over him the way the tides passed over the rocks below the castle, patient and unhurried, wearing him into a truer shape without ever seeming to hurry. And on the evenings when the drills were done and the light had gone soft and gray across the sea, the boy would sit and listen to the baliset while his arms ached pleasantly with the day's work, feeling in his body the good tiredness that comes only after honest effort, that heavy and contented weariness that asks for nothing more than rest. The music would drift low and slow through the old stone, and the sea would breathe against the walls the way it always had, and the boy would feel his eyes grow heavy and his thoughts grow soft, until the whole warm world of Caladan seemed to fold itself gently around him and carry him, without a sound, down into the deep and dreamless sleep that waits at the end of every well-spent day. Word came to Castle Caladan the way great and terrible news so often comes, quietly at first, wrapped in the language of honor and reward, so that at the very beginning it wore the face of a gift. The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, who ruled the known universe from his golden throne upon the imperial world, had chosen to grant House Atreides a fief of enormous value, the desert planet Arrakis, the single source in all the cosmos of the spice melange, that strange and precious substance without which the great ships could not fold the vast distances between the stars, without which the navigators could not see their way, without which the whole delicate web of empire and commerce and long life would slowly come undone. To be given Arrakis was to be given the richest prize in the gift of an emperor, and to the world outside it looked like the highest of favors, a sign that the star of the Atreides was rising toward its zenith. Yet the Duke who ruled Caladan, the father of the boy, was a man of long experience and clear sight, and he understood almost at once that the gift was not what it seemed. For Arrakis had for many long years been held by the Harkonnens, the ancient and bitter enemies of his house, a family grown fat and cruel upon the wealth of the spice, and it strained all reason to believe that so rich a fief would simply be taken from one great house and handed to its rival out of nothing but imperial goodwill. The Duke knew that he had grown too well loved among the great houses of the empire, that his honor and his fairness had won him a following that a jealous emperor might come to fear. And he understood in the cold and steady way of a man who has thought long about power that a rival who cannot be openly struck down is sometimes given a poisoned gift instead, a prize designed to draw him into the open where he might be destroyed and the blame laid upon other hands. So the Duke saw the trap within the treasure, and he spoke of it plainly to those he trusted, naming the danger without flinching, refusing to pretend that the road ahead was anything other than what it was. And yet, having seen the trap, he chose to walk toward it. For there are men whose honor will not let them refuse a duty simply because that duty is dangerous, and he was such a man. To decline the fief would be to defy the emperor openly and to invite ruin at once, and to accept it was to gain, at the least, a fighting chance, a foothold upon the world of the spice, a place from which a clever and honorable house might yet build something lasting. The Duke understood that his true wealth was not the spice itself, but the loyalty of his people and the strength of the fighting force he had gathered. And he set his mind to the hard task of carrying that strength across the darkness between the stars and planting it, watchful and ready, upon the burning sand. The boy, watching his father in those weeks, saw a man carrying a great weight with a steady back, and learned from that sight something that no lesson in a training room could ever have taught him, that leadership was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward with the fear folded quietly away, where it could do no harm to those who depended on him. There were long meetings behind closed doors, the gathering of the mentat and the warriors and the trusted advisors, the slow and careful weaving of plans. And through it all the Duke kept his composure and his kindness, so that the household, sensing his calm, did not fall into panic, even as they understood that everything they had known was about to change. For the whole of the castle now turned toward the enormous labor of departure. The wet green world that had held the family for 26 generations was to be left behind, and everything that could be carried was made ready to be carried, and everything that could not be carried had to be looked upon one last time and quietly let go. The great household of the Atreides, the cooks and the guards and the keepers of old records, the fighting men and the servants and the loyal folk whose families had served the house for longer than anyone could clearly remember. All of them turned their hands to the packing and the loading and the endless small tasks by which a whole way of life is folded up and made ready to travel. For the boy, this was a strange and heavy time, for Caladan was the only home he had ever known. The sea and the rain and the old gray stone, the very substance of his childhood, and now he was to leave it for a place he had seen only in his dreams, a place of endless sand and burning sky. And the dreams had grown stronger in him as the day of leaving drew near. The dreams of the desert world, and of a girl with eyes the color of deep water, whom he had never met in waking life. So that the coming journey seemed to him not only a leaving, but an arriving, a movement towards something that some deep and wordless part of him had been waiting for since before he could put a name to the waiting. He walked the castle in those last days, as one walks through a place one is already beginning to remember, letting his hands rest on the cool stone of the walls, listening to the rain on the high windows, standing at the parapets to watch the gray sea heave and settle far below. He did not weep, for he was his father's son and had been taught to carry things, but a quiet sorrow moved in him nonetheless, the tender ache of a young person understanding for the first time that the world does not hold still, that even the safest and most beloved places are only lent to us for a season, and that growing up means learning again and again to say a gentle goodbye. And yet, beneath the sorrow there ran a thread of something steadier, for the boy trusted his father and his mother and the loyal men who had raised him, and he understood that wherever the house went, the love that held it together would go as well, that home was not finally a place of stone and sea, but a company of people who would keep one another whole. So he made his own small peace with the leaving, gathering the memory of Caladan into himself the way one gathers warmth before a long night, holding the rain and the tides and the old lamplit rooms close in his heart where nothing could take them from him. On the last evening, the great transports waited beyond the castle, dark and enormous against the failing light, and the household moved toward them in a long and orderly stream, carrying the last of what they would take into the dark between the worlds. The boy stood for a moment at the threshold and looked back at the only home he had known, letting the sight of it settle deep. And then he turned his face toward the journey ahead with the quiet courage of the young. And as the great ships rose at last and the green world fell away beneath them into cloud and mist, and finally into the soft blue curve of distance, a stillness came over him. The stillness of a long season gently closing, and his eyes grew heavy with the weariness of much feeling, and he let himself sink slowly down into the deep and cradling dark, carried onward toward the desert and toward sleep. The great ships came down out of the dark and set the House of Atreides upon the world called Dune, and from the first moment, the boy understood that he had arrived in a place utterly unlike the green and dripping world of his childhood. Where Caladan had been all water and mist and soft gray light, Arrakis was a world of fire and thirst, a vast reach of open sand stretching away beneath a sky so bright and hard that it seemed to press down upon the land like a great burning hand. The heat came up to meet them the instant the ports were opened, a dry and enormous heat that pulled at the moisture of the body, and made every breath a thing to be reckoned with. And the boy felt at once how precious water would be in such a place, how a single drop of it would be counted here as riches were counted elsewhere. The family took up its seat in the city that lay at the edge of the desert, a walled and huddled place built to keep the sand and the sun at bay. And from its high windows, the boy looked out upon a landscape that had visited his dreams for so long that seeing it at last felt less like a first meeting than like a return. The dunes ran away toward the horizon in long, slow curves, ridge upon ridge upon ridge, shaped by winds that never truly rested, and beyond them lay the great open desert that the people of this world called simply the deep, the empty and terrible heart of Arrakis, where no city stood and no water flowed, and where, so the stories said, the makers of the sand moved beneath the surface in silence and in hunger. For beneath that endless sand there lived the sandworms, the vast and ancient creatures that the desert people spoke of with a reverence close to worship, beasts so enormous that the largest of them could swallow a great machine whole, drawn up from the depths by any steady rhythm upon the surface, any drumming or pounding that spoke to them of prey. The boy heard the tales of them soon after his arrival, the accounts of harvesting machines lost in an instant to a rising mound of sand, of the ground itself heaving and parting, and he felt in the telling a strange mingling of dread and wonder. For there was something in these creatures that seemed older than the empire, older than any house, as old perhaps as the desert itself. And upon the wind, always, there came the spice. The boy smelled it before he understood what it was. A scent like cinnamon and something deeper, a faint sweetness that hung in the dry air and settled into cloth and skin and the very lining of the lungs, so that soon he could no longer tell whether he was breathing it in or whether it had already become a part of him. This was the melange for which whole empires schemed and whole houses rose and fell, the substance that lengthened life and sharpened sight and made possible the folding of space between the stars. And here it lay upon the wind as freely as dust, the ordinary air of an extraordinary world, the treasure and the curse of Arrakis blowing softly through every waking hour. There were people upon this world who were not of the cities and not of the great houses, a hidden folk who lived out in the deep desert where no outsider could easily follow. And the boy heard of them in whispers and half accounts before he ever saw one plainly. These were the Fremen, the desert people, hardened by generations of thirst into a strength and a discipline that the soft folk of the wetter worlds could scarcely imagine, keepers of secrets and of water, moving through the killing sand as easily as fish move through the sea. The rulers who had come before had thought them a scattered and unimportant people, but the boy's father, with his clear and patient sight, understood almost at once that here might lie the true wealth of Arrakis, not in the spice alone, but in these desert warriors, whose loyalty, if it could be won, would be worth more than any treasury. Among the few who moved between the cities and the deep there was a man of great learning, a planetologist named Kynes, who served the Empire as the judge of the change upon this world, and who carried within him a dream that he shared openly with no one. For Kynes had come to love the desert and its hidden people, and he nursed a vision of what Arrakis might one day become, a slow and patient dream of water brought back to the sand, of green places raised where now there was only thirst, of an entire world remade across the long centuries into a garden. The boy sensed in this man something honest and deep, a devotion not to any house but to the land itself and to the people who had learned to live upon it. And though their meeting was brief, the sense of it stayed with him, the feeling of standing near a person who served something larger than himself. Yet for the boy, the deepest matter of those first days upon Arrakis was not the heat, nor the worms, nor the spice, nor even the desert folk. but the terrible nearness of the future that he had so long dreamed. For here at last was the very landscape of his sleeping visions made real around him. The dunes he had walked in dreams, the light he had seen behind his closed eyes, and with the landscape came a growing sense that the things he had glimpsed were drawing near, that the paths of what might be were narrowing toward what would be. He had dreamed of this world before he ever set foot upon it, and now that he stood within his dream, he felt the strange vertigo of a person who cannot quite tell whether he is remembering or foreseeing, whether the moment before him is happening for the first time or the second. This was a heavy knowledge for one so young, and yet the boy carried it with the quiet steadiness his teachers had labored to give him, letting the strangeness move through him without letting it master him. He watched, and he listened, and he learned, gathering the shape of this new world into himself the way he had once gathered the tides and the rains of Caladan. And slowly, the burning strangeness of Arrakis began to become, if not a home, then at least a place he could begin to understand. He learned the discipline of water, the careful ways of a world where nothing wet was ever wasted, and he felt himself changing, quietly and from within, into someone who might one day belong to the desert rather than merely stand upon it. And when the fierce day at last gave way to the swift falling of the desert night, the boy found that the darkness brought with it a mercy, for the terrible heat drained away into a deep and cooling stillness, and the sky above the dunes opened into a vastness of stars more numerous and more brilliant than any he had ever seen through the clouds of Caladan. He would sit and look up into that enormous quiet, feeling the great desert breathing its slow night breath around him, feeling the day's long strangeness settle at last into something calmer, and a deep tiredness would rise gently through him, the good tiredness of one who has taken in a whole new world and can hold no more of it for now. The cool dark would fold itself around him, patient and kind, and the far stars would soften and blur above the sleeping sand, and the boy would let his heavy eyes fall closed and sink, slow and unafraid, down into the deep still rest that even the desert grants to those who have learned to be quiet within it. The blow that fell upon House Atreides did not come first from the outside, as such blows so often do, but from within, from a wound already carried by one of their own, and this was the cruelest part of the whole cruel matter. For among the trusted people of the house, there was a physician, a gentle and learned man named Wellington Yue, a doctor of the highest order whose conditioning was said to make betrayal impossible, a man the family had welcomed without a shadow of suspicion. And yet this good man carried in his heart a secret agony, for his beloved wife had fallen into the hands of the enemy, and the Baron Harkonnen, that vast and pitiless lord who ruled the rival house, had bent the doctor to his will by the oldest and darkest of leverage, the threat and the false promise woven together around the life of the one the doctor loved most. So the doctor was broken, not by any weakness of his own making, but by love turned against him, made into a traitor against every wish of his own heart. And he moved through the last days of the house, carrying a grief so heavy that it was a wonder the others did not see it in his face. He did what he had been forced to do because he believed, wrongly and tragically, that in doing so he might yet save his wife, and because he had made his own quiet plans within the plans laid upon him, small acts of hidden loyalty tucked inside his betrayal, so that even in his falling he sought some way to strike back at the master who had ruined him. But whatever his intentions, the fact of it was plain and terrible, that the way into the heart of the house was opened from inside, that the defenses so carefully raised were quietly undone by a hand no one thought to watch. And so the night came. It came without warning in the deep dark hours, when the household lay sleeping and the great shields that guarded the city had been made to fail. And through the opened way there poured the forces of the enemy, the soldiers of the Harkonnens, and, moving among them, the dreaded fighting men of the Emperor himself, the Sardaukar, those terrible warriors raised on a world of such harshness that they had become the deadliest soldiers in all the Empire. They came in overwhelming number and in overwhelming skill, and they fell upon the sleeping house with a speed and a savagery that left almost no room for defense, so that what had been a proud and living household became, in the space of a single night, a place of fire and falling and ending. The loyal men of the Atreides fought as they had been trained to fight, with courage and with skill. But they had been betrayed into a hopeless position, their shields down, their numbers small against the flood that came against them. And one by one, the brave and familiar faces of the household were lost in the chaos of that dreadful night. The warriors who had guarded the boy since his infancy, the men who had taught him and watched over him and loved him in their gruff and undemonstrative way, gave everything they had in defense of the house, and many of them gave their very lives, so that the price of that single night was paid in the blood of the most loyal people the family had ever known. At the heart of the ruin fell the Duke himself, the boy's father, that man of honor and clear sight who had seen the trap and walked into it, because his duty gave him no other road. He was taken by the enemy and brought before the vast and gloating Baron, and there, held helpless, he was made the instrument of one last defiance, for he had been given by the broken doctor a hidden means of striking a final blow. The Duke died in that attempt, giving his life in a last effort to reach his enemy, and though the blow did not fall as it was meant to, there was in his ending a terrible dignity. The dignity of a man who refused to the very last to be merely a victim, who spent the final breath of his honorable life reaching toward the one who had destroyed his house. So passed the good Duke Leto, the father the boy had loved and watched and learned from, gone in a single night from the living world, leaving behind only the memory of his steady voice and his patient kindness, and the quiet lessons of honor that he had woven, without ever seeming to teach them, into the very grain of his son. All that the Duke had been, all the calm strength and the careful fairness that had made his people love him, passed now out of the reach of the living, and the boy would carry the loss of it for the rest of his days, as one carries a stone sewn into the lining of the heart, heavy and hidden and always there. And the boy and his mother, who were meant to die as well, who were carried out into the desert to be quietly disposed of, so that no trace of the house might remain to trouble the conscience of the Empire, were spared by the very same broken doctor whose betrayal had doomed them. For even in his ruin he could not bring himself to send the innocent to a clean death, and he had arranged, within the plan laid upon him, that they might have a slender chance at life. So it was that the last two of the great house, the lady and her son, found themselves cast out into the killing sand, stripped of everything they had possessed, hunted and alone beneath the terrible open sky, with nothing left to them but each other and the hard skills that had been folded into them across all the years of their sheltered life. For the boy this was a night beyond the reach of any lesson, a night in which the whole warm world he had known was torn away in the space of a few dark hours. His father gone, his loyal protectors gone, his home a burning ruin behind him, and only the empty desert ahead. And yet, in the very depths of that ruin, something turned within him, something that had been waiting to wake. For the terror and the grief of that night broke open a door in his mind, and his strange gift came surging through it. The prescience that had troubled his dreams for so long, rising now into his waking eyes, so that even in the midst of his sorrow he began to see, dimly and terribly, the branching roads of what might come. The boy who had gone into that night as a sheltered heir came out of it as something new and harder and more sorrowful. A boy grown suddenly older than his years, carrying a grief that would never entirely leave him, and a sight that would never again fully close. Yet even in such darkness, there is mercy for those who have been broken. And the mercy that came to the boy that night was the oldest mercy of all, that grief exhausts itself, that even the deepest sorrow cannot hold its full weight forever, that the body, worn past bearing, will at last demand its rest. And so, when the immediate danger had for a little while receded, when he and his mother had found some small hidden place to draw breath in the vast indifferent dark, the terrible tension that had held him upright began at last to loosen, and a heavy weariness moved up through him like a slow tide, dulling the sharp edges of his pain. The desert night lay cool and enormous and silent all around them, the stars wheeling slowly overhead as they had wheeled long before any house had risen or fallen. And beneath their patient and ancient light, the exhausted boy felt his grief soften at its edges into numbness, and his numbness soften into weariness, and his weariness at last into the deep and merciful dark of sleep, which came to carry him, for a little while, away from all of it, down into a stillness where even sorrow could not follow. When the boy and his mother rose from that first stolen rest, they rose into a world that wished them dead, and the days that followed became a long and desperate passage across the open desert, a flight from hunters who believed them already lost, and who searched the sand to be certain of it. They had been left with little, but among the little there was a small flying craft, a light machine meant for short passages above the dunes, and in this they took to the air and fled outward, away from the ruin of the city and into the vast and trackless emptiness of the deep desert, that enormous silence where no house ruled and no map held true, where the only law was the law of thirst and sand and the great makers that moved below. They flew low across the dunes to keep beneath the notice of those who searched for them, and the boy, whose strange sight had opened wide upon the night of the fall, found that he could feel the shape of the danger around them, could sense the searching craft before they came into view, could read in the flickering roads of the future which turnings led toward capture and which toward another hour of life. This was a fearful gift to carry, for it showed him not one path but many, a branching thicket of things that might be, and he had to learn even in the midst of his flight how to move among these visions without losing himself in them, how to use the sight without letting the sight use him. The desert itself became their greatest peril and, strangely, their greatest shield, for the same terrible emptiness that could kill them also hid them, and the same fierce forces that threatened their lives also drove off those who hunted them. There came upon them at one point a great storm of the desert, one of those enormous walls of driven sand that rise without warning and sweep across the land with a violence that can strip the flesh from bone and tear apart any machine that dares to fly within it. Such a storm was death to enter, and yet it was also a place no hunter would follow. And so the boy, trusting the swift readings of his opened mind and the hard training of his hands, took them into the very edge of that howling chaos, riding the terrible winds where no sane pursuer would venture, letting the storm itself carry them beyond the reach of those who sought their lives. They came through the storm as through a trial, battered and half-buried and alive, and set down at last in a place so remote that for the first time since the fall they could believe themselves, for a little while, unwatched. But the desert offered no true rest, for above the peril of the hunters and the storms there lay always the deepest peril of all, the makers, the great sandworms that came to any steady rhythm upon the surface, drawn up from the depths by the drumming of an engine or the regular fall of a walking foot. The boy and his mother learned that they could not move across the open sand as they had always moved across solid ground, that the very rhythm of an ordinary step would call up death from below. And so they began to learn, out of sheer need, the first of the desert's hardest lessons, the broken and irregular walk that spoke to the sand of wind and shifting dune rather than of living prey. In the midst of this long flight there came to them, out of the ruin they had left behind, one last gift of loyalty for the swordmaster Duncan Idaho, that swift and shining teacher whom the boy had loved as much as any man alive, had survived the fall and found his way to them across the desert. For a brief and precious span they were 3 instead of 2, and the boy felt, in the presence of that familiar and beloved face, a warmth he had thought lost forever in the fire of the city. But the hunters were not far behind, and when at last they were found and cornered, Duncan did what such men do. He stood between those he loved and the death that came for them, and he spent his own life to buy them the time to escape. He fought until he could fight no longer, holding the enemy while the boy and his mother slipped away into the sand, and so the last of the boy's great teachers was lost, given freely for the sake of the life he had helped to shape. The grief of that loss lay heavy upon the boy, coming so soon after the grief of his father and his home, and yet the desert would not let him stop to mourn, for the desert asked always and only whether one would live or die within the next hour, and answered every hesitation with death. So the boy carried his sorrow the way he had learned to carry so much else, folded quietly away where it could not slow his feet, and pressed on across the sand with his mother at his side, the two of them alone once more beneath the enormous and indifferent sky. And as they walked and hid and walked again, something was happening within the boy that neither of them could have named at first. A slow and terrible shaping, for the desert was working upon him the way the sea works upon a stone, wearing away everything soft and unneeded, and leaving behind something harder and truer and more nearly ready for what was to come. His visions grew stronger with each passing day, unfolding before his inner sight like a great and shifting landscape, showing him not only the immediate dangers of the sand, but the far and dreadful shapes of futures that reached out beyond anything he could yet understand. He saw roads that led to terrible things, and roads that led to greatness bound up with terror, and he began to grasp, in a way that frightened him even as it steadied him, that his own life was becoming a thing of enormous consequence, that the small hunted boy crossing the sand carried within him the seed of events that might one day shake the whole of the empire. This was a weight that no boy should have to carry, and yet he carried it, because the desert gave him no choice but to carry it, and because somewhere within him, below the fear and the grief, a strength was rising to meet the burden. So the desert became his crucible, the great fire in which the last of his childhood was burned away, and the beginnings of the man he would become were forged. He learned its cruelties and its mercies, its killing thirst and its hiding silences, its storms and its worms and its endless patient sand, and slowly, without ever quite deciding to, he began to belong to it, to move within it as one who was learning its ways rather than merely fleeing across its surface. The boy who had been born beside the gentle sea was becoming, step by hidden step, a child of the burning sand, and the desert that had been sent to kill him was quietly making him its own. And when at last the fierce day burned itself out and the swift, cool dark came down once more upon the dunes, the boy and his mother would find some sheltered hollow in the sand and lie down together in the great silence, worn past the very edge of endurance, and the desert night would spread its enormous quiet over them like a blanket drawn up by a patient hand. The far stars would wheel in their slow and ancient courses. The cooling sand would give back the day's heat in a soft and steady breath. And the boy, safe for one more night against all the odds, would feel the long tension of survival at last release its hold upon him. His heavy eyes would close against the immense and gentle dark. His breathing would slow to match the slow breathing of the desert itself, and he would sink, unafraid, down through his weariness and his grief and his strange, unfolding sight, into the deep and cradling rest that the sand keeps for those who have learned, at last, to lie still within it. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes only in the deep desert after the storms have passed and the night has settled its cool weight upon the sand. And it was into that quiet that Paul and his mother came at last, worn thin by flight and hunger, when they were found by the people who lived hidden within the folds of the rock. They did not stumble upon these people so much as they were gathered up by them, for the desert folk had watched the two strangers from a distance for some time, reading their movements across the dunes the way a careful reader follows a line of old and faded script. And when at last the desert folk stepped out of the shadows of the broken stone, they came quietly, without haste, as men come who know the land utterly and have nothing to fear from it. At their head stood a lean and weathered man named Stilgar, a leader among them. His eyes the deep total blue that the spice gives to those who breathe it and taste it all their lives. And though there was hardness in his bearing, there was also a strange and watchful courtesy, the manner of a man who weighs each life against the water it holds and finds even a stranger worth considering. For a long moment, the two parties stood upon the sand beneath the enormous stillness of the stars, and there passed between them the slow reckoning of strangers who must decide whether to be enemies or something gentler. And in that reckoning, Jessica moved with the quiet certainty of her long training, and Paul stood beside her with the calm that had been growing in him through all the hard days of the flight. And the desert people saw in the two of them something they had not expected, a strength that did not boast of itself, a stillness that answered their own. And so instead of leaving them to the sand and the worms, Stilgar chose to take them in. And the band of desert folk closed softly around mother and son and led them away across the dunes toward the hidden place that was their home, walking through the dark with the sure, unhurried steps of people who belong entirely to the world they cross. The home of these people was a warren carved and grown within the living rock, a sietch, a hidden warren of chambers and passages sealed away from the burning day. And to come into it after the raw exposure of the open sand was to pass from a world of endless emptiness into a world of warmth and murmuring life. There were moisture seals across the passages that caught the breath of the living and gave it back to the community. And there were glowing lamps and woven hangings and the smell of spice and of many people gathered close. And everywhere there was the soft industry of a folk who had made a life in a place that should not have permitted any life at all. Paul walked through these passages beside his mother and felt the sietch fold around him like a held breath, and something in him that had been braced and wary through all the long ordeal began, very slowly, to loosen. Among these people, water was not a small thing, and this above all Paul came to understand in those first days within the rock. Water was reverence itself. Water was the measure of a life and the shared wealth of the whole community, gathered drop by drop and hoarded against the future, wept for and counted and never once wasted. The stillsuits they wore reclaimed the body's own moisture, so that not even a tear or a breath was given uselessly to the air. And the water of the dead was rendered back to the tribe, so that a life ended became water for the living. And in all of this, there was no greed, but rather a deep and solemn tenderness, a way of holding fast to the one thing that made their world survivable. Paul saw how the desert had shaped these people into something hard and enduring, and yet bound together by a fierce loyalty. Each one a warrior, each one a keeper of the shared life, and he began to sense how a folk so strong and so hidden might one day matter far beyond the limits of their sand. Jessica too was watched and weighed in those days, for the desert people carried among themselves old prophecies planted long ago, half-remembered promises of a mother and a son who would come from beyond the world to lead them. And there were those among them who looked at Jessica and at the boy beside her and wondered whether the old words were stirring at last. And so the strangers were not merely tolerated, but studied, tested in small, quiet ways, given tasks and given trust in slow, careful measures, until the siege as a whole began to make its peace with their presence and to fold them, cautiously, into the rhythm of its days. It was here, within the warm, dim heart of the rock, that Paul at last came face to face with the girl he had seen so many times in the strange dreams that had haunted him since childhood. The girl of the desert, with the eyes that held the whole of the night in them. Her name was Chani, and she moved through the Sietch with the easy grace of one born to it. And when Paul saw her waking, standing before him in the flesh at last, after all the sleeping visions, it was as though two long separated halves of a single thing had quietly come together. There were no grand words between them, and no sudden fire, only a slow and steady recognition, the kind that settles rather than flares. And from that first meeting there grew between the boy and the desert girl the beginnings of something patient and deep, a thread that would run through all the rest of his life. In the way of these people, a stranger taken into the Sietch was given a name that belonged to the desert and to the tribe, a private name to be used within the warmth of the community. And after his worth had been shown and his place among them made, Paul was given such a name, and the name they gave him was Usul, which in their old tongue meant the strength at the base of the pillar, the deep, sure foundation upon which a thing might stand. And to be given that name was to be no longer merely a fugitive sheltering among strangers, but a member of the tribe, one of the hidden people of the sand. And Paul carried the name quietly within him and felt how it changed the shape of who he was becoming. So the boy who had been born the heir of a great and distant house, who had fled across the burning dunes with death close behind him, came at last to rest within the hidden heart of the desert, taken in by a strong and secret people, learning the reverence they held for every drop of water, meeting at last the girl who had walked so long through his dreams, and receiving from the tribe a new and rooted name. And as the Sietch settled into its night around him, the lamps dimmed low, and the murmur of the many lives softening into the slow breathing of sleep, Paul lay in the warmth of the living rock, with his mother near and the desert people all around, safe for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. And he felt the great fear that had ridden him for so many days ease its grip and slip away into the dark. And you, listening now, may let it slip away as well. May let the warmth of that hidden shelter gather softly around you. May let the reverent stillness of the deep Sietch carry you down and down, past thought, past worry, into the same deep and grateful rest that folded at last over the boy called Usul beneath the sheltering stone. To live among the desert people was to learn the desert itself, and this learning came to Paul not in a single lesson, but in the slow accumulation of days, the way sand builds a dune grain upon patient grain, until at last there stands a thing that was not there before. He had come into the Sietch a stranger, sheltered by the kindness of others, and now, given the name Usul and a place among the tribe, he set himself to becoming truly one of them, to shedding the softness of the green world he had been born to, and taking on instead the hard and graceful competence of those who had made the burning sand their home. And the desert people, seeing his willingness and his uncommon quickness, took him in hand and began to teach him all the countless small arts by which a body might be kept alive in a place that seemed made for nothing but death. The first of these arts, and perhaps the strangest to him at the start, was the way one walked upon the open sand. For the great worms of the deep desert, the vast creatures the people called by the old name Shai-Hulud, came to any steady rhythm that beat against the dunes, drawn up from the deep by the drumming of a regular step. And so, to walk safely, one had to learn to walk without rhythm, to break one's stride into a shuffling and uneven measure, a shifting cadence that mimicked the natural settling of the sand itself, and left no steady pulse for the worm to hear. Paul practiced this walk under the eyes of the desert folk until it became not a thing he thought about, but a thing his body simply knew. A broken, graceful gait that let him cross the open dunes as one of the people crossed them, unremarkable to the great presence that moved beneath. He learned, too, the deep art of the stillsuit, that close and clever garment which the desert people wore against their skin, a suit woven to reclaim the body's own moisture, to catch the sweat and the breath and the water of the body and return it, filtered and cooled, to be drunk again through a tube at the neck, so that a man might walk for many days in the killing heat and lose almost nothing of the water that kept him living. To wear the stillsuit rightly, to fit it and seal it and trust it, was among the first things any child of the desert learned, and Paul learned it now, feeling how the suit made of his own body a small closed world that carried its own survival within it. And with the suit and the rhythmless walk, he began to move through the desert not as a fugitive fleeing across it, but as one who belonged to it, who read its winds and its temperatures and its long, slow moods. There were the arts of fighting as well, for the desert people were warriors to the last of them, and though Paul came to them already trained in the disciplines of the blade by the sword masters of his lost house, he found that the fighting of the desert had its own hard character, close and quick and unforgiving, suited to the tight passages of the siege and the sudden violence of the open sand. He gave what he knew, and he took what they taught, and in the giving and the taking he grew closer still to the people around him. For there is a particular bond that forms between those who train their bodies side by side toward the same hard ends, and that bond wove Paul deeper into the life of the tribe with every passing season. And through all of it, the girl called Chani was near, and the quiet thread between them grew stronger, steadied by shared labor and shared danger, until it had become one of the settled and certain things of his life. Yet there remained one final art, greater than all the others, the art that stood at the very center of what it meant to be a full man among the desert people, and that was the calling and the writing of the great worm itself. For these people, alone among all the folk of the burning world, had learned across the long centuries to summon the vast creatures of the deep, to stand upon the open sand and set a rhythm going with a device that beat against the dune, drawing the worm up from below, and then, as the enormous living wall of it rose and rushed toward them, to run alongside and mount it, to open its foremost segments with hooks made for that purpose, and hold them open, so that the great creature, unable to close against the sand, would rise to the surface and could be steered across the dunes. To do this once, cleanly and alone, was to pass from boyhood into manhood in the reckoning of the tribe, and no one who had not done it could truly be counted a full man of the desert. And so at last the day came when Paul went out to make his own calling, out onto the wide and shimmering sand under the great burning eye of the sun, with the people gathered to watch and to judge, and he set the rhythm beating into the dune and waited with a calm that had grown very deep in him. And out of the far distance, the sand began to lift and to move, and the great worm came. It came as a mountain comes. If a mountain could run, a vast and ancient presence surging up through the dunes with a sound like the whole world breathing. And Paul stood in its path with his hooks ready and his heart steady, and as the enormous creature crested toward him, he ran, And he leapt, and he took his hold, and he opened the great segments, and he climbed. And then he was upon it, riding high upon the back of Shai-Hulud, as it rose full into the light, and carried him thundering across the open desert. The wind of that ride tore past him, and the sand streamed away beneath him, and the whole vast burning world opened out around him. And in that moment, Paul was no longer a boy sheltering among strangers, but a man of the desert, one who had called and ridden the great worm, as his adopted people had done since the beginning of their long memory. When he brought the worm at last to the edge of its strength, and stepped down from it, and let it sink away exhausted into the deep sand, the desert people came to him, and counted him truly one of their own, a full man of the tribe. And Paul felt the last distance between himself and this hard and noble folk quietly close. He had come to them a hunted stranger from a soft green world, and he had made himself, patiently and completely, into a child of the sand, one who walked without rhythm, and wore the stillsuit as a second skin, and fought in the close hard way of the desert, and rode the great worm across the dunes. And as the long day faded, and the people turned back together toward the sheltering rock, the fierce heat draining out of the air, and the cool blue of evening settling over the endless sand, Paul walked among them tired and content, filled with the deep and simple satisfaction of one who has become fully what he set out to become. So let that same weary contentment settle now over you, the good and honest tiredness that comes after a long day's true labor, when the body has done all that was asked of it and asks now only for rest. Let the wide desert grow quiet and cool in your mind. Let the great worm sink away into the deep and the wind fall still. And let the slow, soft evening of the sand carry you gently down, as it carried down the man called Usul, into a long and peaceful and untroubled sleep. Deep within the life of the desert people there lay a mystery greater and more perilous than any art of walking or fighting or worm riding, a thing spoken of only in low voices and approached only with the gravest care. And this was the sacred substance they called the water of life. It was drawn, in a way known only to a few, from the drowning of one of the small young worms of the deep. And in its raw and unaltered state, it was a poison so violent that to swallow it untransformed was to die. And yet, within the ritual life of the tribe, it held the very center of their oldest and most holy practice. For among these people there were women of great age and greater wisdom, reverend mothers, keepers of the tribe's deepest memory, and each of them had come into her power by taking the terrible poison into her own body, and by an inward act that few could perform, changing it, transmuting it within herself from a thing that killed into a thing that opened the inner eye. And when the time came for the old keeper of the Sayach to pass her burden onward, it was Jessica, Paul's mother, who was chosen to receive it. The ritual by which Jessica took the water of life was a thing of great solemnity and great danger, for she was to drink the raw poison before the gathered people, and, in the moment of its killing, reach inward and change it, or else die. And Jessica, trained through all her years in the deep disciplines of body and mind, carrying moreover the unborn child that was her daughter close beneath her heart, took the sacred and terrible substance into herself, and went down into the darkness of it, and there, in a place beyond ordinary sight, she wrestled the poison, and mastered it, and turned it, and rose again transformed, a reverend mother now, carrying within her the long, unbroken chain of memory that such women passed from one to the next across the centuries. Yet in the doing of it, a strange thing happened, for the unborn daughter within her, touched by the same opening flood while still in the womb, woke early to awareness, and came into the world already knowing, already old in some quiet inward way, a child unlike any other, But it was the greater transformation, the one that touched Paul himself, that the deep purpose of these events had been moving toward all along. For Paul had grown, through all his years of teaching and trial and desert living, into something that had never before existed, the culmination of a long and secret breeding that the sisterhood of his mother had guided across many lifetimes toward a single hoped-for end. A being who might bridge in his one mind the powers that until then no single person had been able to hold together, who might look with open eyes into places within himself that were closed to all others. His dreams had shown him fragments of what was coming for as long as he could remember, and his prescient sight had widened season by season among the dunes, until he understood that there remained one last threshold he had not yet crossed, one final ordeal that stood between the man he was and the whole of what he might become. And that threshold was the water of life itself, taken now not as his mother had taken it, but as no man before him had ever survived taking it. And so, understanding what he risked and driven by the deep necessity that had shaped his whole life, Paul took the sacred poison into his own body. What followed was not a waking ordeal that others could watch and measure, but a plunge into a stillness so complete that to those who kept watch over him, he seemed to have crossed clean over into death. His breath sank away until it could not be found. His body lay cold and unmoving upon the stone, and for many long days he did not stir, so that even those who loved him and hoped for him began to fear that he had gone too far and would not return. Chani stayed near him through that long stillness, and his mother watched over him, and the sietch held its breath around the motionless form of the young man who had dared what none had dared before, waiting through the slow procession of the days to learn whether he would wake or whether the poison had claimed him at the last. Yet Paul was not dead, but rather gone very far inward, down into the deepest chambers of himself, and there he did the thing that no man had been able to do, the thing that the women could do, but that had always killed any man who tried it. He found the poison spreading its death through him, and he reached toward it not with his hands, but with the whole of his awakened inner power, and he took hold of it and changed it, altered its very nature within the tissues of his own body, turning the substance of death into the substance of vision. And as he did this, a great opening happened within him, a widening beyond anything he had known, so that the narrow forward glimpses of his old dreams gave way all at once to a vast and shoreless sight in which the past lay open behind him in an endless lit corridor of remembered lives, and the branching possibilities of the future spread out before him in their countless shining paths. And the present hung all around him in a clarity so total that he could see the hidden shape of things and the currents beneath the currents. He had crossed the last threshold, and on the far side of it he was awake in a way that no person had ever been awake, holding within one mind the fullness of what the long secret working of generations had labored to bring into being. When at last he stirred, and his breath returned, and his eyes opened upon the anxious faces gathered around him, Paul rose changed, quiet and steady and immeasurably deepened, carrying now within himself the terrible clarity of one who could see across time in both directions at once. Those who had watched over him saw at once that something in him had altered beyond return, that the young man of the desert had passed through his stillness into something larger and stranger, and there settled over the sietch a hush of awe, the recognition that a thing long promised and long doubted had finally come to pass among them. Paul himself carried the great open sight with a gravity beyond his years, for to see so much was also to bear so much, and already he felt the weight of the countless futures pressing upon him, the terrible knowledge of the paths that lay ahead. Yet in this hour that weight had not yet fully descended, and there remained the simple mercy of having survived, of having come back from the death-like deep, of lying warm and living once more among those who had kept faith through the long dark of his stillness. And so let this be the image that carries you now toward your own rest. The image of one who went down into a stillness so deep it looked like death, and yet rose from it whole, transformed and living, breath returning soft and slow to a body that had lain so long in silence. Let your own breath grow that soft and that slow. Let it sink away toward the same deep quiet, not the quiet of any danger, but only the gentle quiet of true rest. Let the long stillness gather you as it gathered him, calm and complete and untroubled, and let it carry you down past thought and past all watching, softly and safely, into a deep and dreamless sleep. After the great stillness had passed, and Paul had risen from it changed, there came into his life a new name, and with the name a new place in the world, and with the place a weight of hope and expectation heavier than any he had yet carried. For it was the custom of the desert people that a man might take upon himself a secret and chosen name drawn from the creatures and the signs of their own hidden world, a name that spoke of what he was becoming, and the name Paul took was Muad'Dib. After the small desert mouse whose ways the people admired, the little creature that lived wholly within the dry land and needed no water beyond what the land itself gave, that moved by night and knew the secrets of survival and was counted a sign of the desert's own wisdom. In choosing that name, Paul bound himself still more deeply to the sand and to the folk of the sand, taking to himself a thing of their own world rather than of the great worlds beyond. And among the people the name spread quickly and took root, so that the man who had come to them a hunted stranger was now known across the Sietch by a name that belonged entirely to the desert. Yet the name Muad'Dib was only one of the names that gathered around him in those days. For the desert people carried among themselves an old and abiding hope, a prophecy long planted in their hearts, that there would come to them one from beyond their world who would lead them out of their long hardship into a promised abundance, one who could see what others could not see and know what others could not know. And when they looked upon this young man who had crossed the death-like deep and returned with the whole of time laid open behind his eyes, when they saw his mother made a reverend mother and his strange knowing sister born already awake, when they measured his uncanny sight and his steady power and his deep binding to their ways, more and more of them began to say among themselves that here at last was the one the old words had promised, the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, the one who had been foretold. And though Paul himself, seeing so much and so far, understood the tangled truth of how such prophecies had come to be planted, and knew the peril of the fervor now kindling around him, still the belief spread, moving from Sietch to Sietch across the wide desert like water, finding its way through hidden channels in the rock. The rise of that belief changed everything for the young man from Caladan, where once he had been a single fugitive sheltered by the kindness of one tribe. He became now a center toward which the scattered desert people began to turn, a figure whose name was spoken in far warrens he had never seen, whose deeds and whose sayings were carried across the dunes by travelers and traders and pilgrims until they had grown into legend well beyond anything he had actually done. There is a strange power in a name once a longing people take hold of it, for the name begins to grow of its own accord, gathering to itself stories that were never quite true and hopes that no single man could ever fulfill. And Paul watched this happen to his own two names with the clear and troubled sight of one who understood exactly what was being made of him. He had seen in his opened vision how the deep hunger of the desert people, kept waiting for so many long generations, could take a single figure and lift him far above the ordinary size of a man. And he knew that such lifting, once begun, could not easily be stopped or slowed. And so he moved through the growing devotion, with care, honoring it and using it, and fearing it all at once. The desert folk, who had always lived apart, tribe from tribe, each keeping to its own rock and its own water, began to look outward toward this one figure who seemed to draw the whole of their long-divided people toward a single hope, and there gathered around Muad'Dib a devotion fierce and deep, the devotion of a hard people who had waited a very long time and believed at last that their waiting was ending. Around him, too, his own family was transformed by all that had happened. His mother, Jessica, moved now among the people as a reverend mother, keeper of the deep memory and voice of great authority within the ritual life of the tribes, her position lending weight and sanction to the hope rising around her son, so that mother and son together came to stand at the very heart of the desert people's faith. And his sister, the child Alia, born already awake from the water of life that had touched her in the womb, grew among them as a being strange and unsettling and wholly without precedent, a small child who spoke and knew with the depth of the ancient reverend mothers, carrying within her the same opened memory that her mother carried, so that the people regarded her with a mingling of awe and unease, another sign among the many signs that something long promised was unfolding among them. Together this family, cast out to die in the desert and instead taken up and exalted by it, had become the living center of a movement that was gathering force with every passing season. And through all of this, the quiet love between Paul and Chani endured and deepened, a still center within the rising storm of legend, for whatever names the people gave him and whatever hopes they laid upon him. With Chani he remained simply himself, the man she had known since he came to the Sietch, and her steadiness beside him was among the few things that kept him whole beneath the growing weight of what he was becoming. For it was no small burden to be made the vessel of a whole people's faith, to see one's ordinary words and deeds swell into legend, to feel a great and hungry devotion gathering around one's name, and Paul carried that burden with a gravity that grew heavier as the belief in him grew stronger. Yet in these days, the movement was still young, still gathering, still only beginning to sense its own coming strength, and there was in it a kind of hope that had not yet turned toward anything harder, the pure early hope of a long oppressed people who felt at last that a change was coming. So the fugitive had become a leader, forged from a hunted boy into the named, and awaited one of the desert, Muad'Dib to those who loved him, and Lisan al-Gaib to those who believed the old prophecies. His legend spreading from warren to warren across the endless sand. His mother a reverend mother, and his sister a child of uncanny knowing, and his beloved a steady light beside him. He had come into the desert with nothing but his life and his mother's, and now the whole of the hidden people were turning toward him as toward a dawn long promised and long delayed. And though he saw in his open sight all the peril that such faith might one day bring, in this hour there was mostly the gathering, the rising, the slow, sure coalescing of a scattered people around a single name. And so let the gathering settle now into stillness for you, the way a great crowd, having drawn together at last, grows quiet as the evening comes, its voices sinking, its many lives easing toward rest beneath the darkening sky. Let the far warrens of the desert grow silent one by one. Let the lamps dim in their carved chambers. Let the whole of that hopeful people lie down together into the cool blue quiet of the desert night. And let yourself lie down among them in your mind, held within that vast and gentle stillness, carried softly by it, down past all thought and all striving, into a deep and peaceful and untroubled sleep. The hope that had gathered around Muad'Dib might have remained only hope, a warm belief passed from warren to warren across the sand, had he not turned it now, patiently and with great care, into a thing of strength and purpose. For the desert people, though fierce and hardy and unmatched within their own land, had always lived divided, tribe apart from tribe, each keeping to its own rock and its own water and its own long grudges, and no single hand had ever drawn them together into one. Yet Paul, seeing across the branching paths of time and understanding what force lay sleeping in these scattered folk, set himself to the slow and delicate work of welding the many tribes into a single people with a single will, going from Siach to Siach, honoring the customs and the leaders of each, binding the warriors of one warren to the warriors of another, until the old divisions began to soften, and the many bands of the desert began to think of themselves not as rival tribes, but as one great gathering with one great purpose. It was work that could not be forced, for these were proud people who would follow no man who did not prove himself worthy. And so Paul proved himself again and again, in counsel and in courage, until the loyalty of the whole desert flowed toward him as water flows toward the lowest and deepest place. And to this united people, Paul gave more than a common purpose, for he brought to them a way of fighting that they had never known, drawn from the deep disciplines of his lost house and his mother's secret arts and his own opened understanding, a manner of battle so swift and so uncanny that those who faced it could scarcely comprehend what struck them. This the people came to call the weirding way, the strange and formidable fighting art that Paul and his mother taught to the chosen warriors of the desert, a way of moving and striking that used the trained control of breath and muscle to make of a single fighter a force that seemed almost beyond the natural, so that a small band of these desert warriors could fall upon a far larger enemy and shatter it before it understood what had come against it. Trained in this way, and already the hardest fighters that the burning world had ever produced, the united tribes of the desert became a weapon such as had not existed before. A hidden army growing in strength within the deep sand, patient and disciplined and utterly devoted to the man who led them. With this gathering power in hand, Paul did not fling it recklessly against his enemies, but wielded it with the careful patience of one who could see the shape of things to come. He struck first, and most tellingly, at the thing his enemies most treasured, the harvest of the precious spice that was the whole reason the great powers had ever come to this world. For the spice was drawn only from these sands and nowhere else in all the known worlds, and whoever controlled its flow held a lever upon the whole of the empire beyond the sky. The desert warriors, moving as only they could move across the open dunes, fell upon the machines and the crews that gathered the spice, striking swiftly and vanishing again into the sand before any answer could be made, so that the steady harvest upon which the wider empire depended began to falter and grow uncertain. And they struck too at the strongholds of the harsh and cruel house that had seized this world and slaughtered Paul's own family, raiding their outposts and cutting their supply and bleeding their strength little by little, until the grip of those hated overlords upon the desert began to loosen and to fail. What made these strikes so terrible to the enemy was not only their force, but their seeming impossibility. For the great powers had long dismissed the desert people as scattered and backward wanderers of no account, hardly worth the counting. And now, those same dismissed wanderers were rising out of the sand in disciplined strength, striking with an art no one could match, and melting away again into a desert that no outsider could survive. The very land that the invaders had always regarded as their greatest obstacle had become instead the greatest weapon of the people who understood it. For the desert warriors carried their own water and read their own winds and rode the great worms across distances that no machine of the enemy could safely cross, so that they could appear where they were least expected and vanish where no pursuit could follow. And behind every raid there stood the quiet, guiding mind of Muad'Dib, who could see in his open sight the branching outcomes of each stroke before it fell, choosing always the path that gathered the most strength and spent the fewest lives of his people, so that the desert army grew stronger with each season, rather than weaker, hardened and emboldened by a run of victories that seemed to the enemy to come out of nowhere at all. The overlords sent their forces against the raiders and found nothing to strike back at, only the empty dunes and the burning wind, while their spice grew scarcer and their strongholds grew weaker, and the losses mounted season upon season. And slowly, as the reports traveled outward across the empire, a thing that had begun as scattered incidents in a place no one thought about began to take on a different and more troubling shape. The shape of a genuine and rising power where none had been thought possible. For beyond the desert world, out among the great houses and the imperial throne itself, there began to spread an unease that grew steadily toward alarm. The Padishah emperor who ruled the known worlds, and the ancient noble houses that circled his throne, and all the great powers that had for so long divided the wealth of the galaxy among themselves, began to hear of the failing spice and the vanishing garrisons and the strange, invincible warriors of the sand. And though at first they could scarcely credit that so much trouble could come from so despised a place, the tremors kept coming, and the spice kept faltering, and the sense grew among them that something they did not understand was stirring at the very source of all their wealth. They had built their whole order upon the endless flow of the spice, and now the ground of that order had begun, faintly and unmistakably, to shake beneath them, and the powers of the empire began at last to turn their uneasy attention toward the desert world and the shadowy leader whose name was carried on every troubling report. So the scattered tribes had become one people, and the one people had become an army, and the army, armed with the weirding way and led by the man who could see the paths of the future, had begun to shake the foundations of the whole empire from its hidden place within the sand. What had begun as the faith of a hard and hopeful folk gathered around a single name had grown into a force that the greatest powers of the known worlds could no longer ignore, a tremor rising out of the desert that would soon become something far greater. And Muad'Dib stood at the center of it all, patient and steady and grave, holding the gathered strength of the desert in a careful hand, knowing far more than any around him of what lay ahead, and moving with the deliberate calm of one who understood that the greatest reckoning was still to come. But that reckoning belonged to another hour, and for now there was only the vast desert night settling once again over the Sayach and the sand. The raids ended, and the warriors returned, the gathered people resting within their carved and sheltering rock, the great slow breath of the desert rising and falling beneath the wheeling stars. And so let that same deep calm settle now over you, the calm of great forces gathered, and then, for a while, laid quietly to rest, the calm of a strength that has done its day's work and asks now only for the night. Let the desert grow still and cool around you. Let the far tremors fade into silence. Let the endless sand lie quiet beneath the stars. And let that vast and gentle stillness carry you softly down, unhurried and untroubled, into a long and peaceful and healing sleep. There came a season, near the end of all his years of hiding and gathering, when Paul Atreides decided that the waiting was over, and that the great powers who had scattered his house and killed his father would at last be drawn down onto the sand where he was strongest. He did not rush toward this reckoning, for he had seen it many times already in the branching corridors of his prescient sight, and he knew its shape the way a sleeper knows the shape of a familiar room in the dark. He knew that the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV would come to Arrakis in person, riding down from the black gulf between the stars in a great vessel so vast it carried a whole city of courtiers and functionaries within its metal walls. And with him would come the legions of the Sardaukar, the terrible soldier fanatics of the prison world, men trained from birth in cruelty and discipline, men who had never truly been beaten in open war. And Paul knew too that his own people, the ragged and patient Fremen of the deep desert, would be waiting for them, hidden in the folds of the dunes like water hidden beneath stone. The emperor came because the trade in spice had faltered, because the harvests were failing and the great machines were burning in the sand, and because a name had risen out of the desert that even the throne of the known universe could no longer ignore. He came to crush a rebellion he did not understand, surrounded by the proud lords of the great houses, watched by the cold representatives of the Spacing Guild who feared for their monopoly, and shadowed by the surviving Harkonnens, the old enemies who had hunted Paul across the sand and had never guessed that the boy they thought dead had grown into the storm now bearing down upon them all. The emperor set his ships upon the plain before the shield wall, that great rampart of rock that sheltered the city, and he raised about his encampment a mighty barrier of metal and force, believing himself safe behind it, believing that the desert could be conquered as every other world had been conquered, by fear and by fire. But the desert had its own weather, and the desert had its own creatures, and Paul had spent long years learning to read both. He had watched the sky and the sand until he knew that a storm was coming, one of the vast and terrible storms of Arrakis that could scour the flesh from bone and strip the paint from metal. A wall of wind and grit, taller than any tower, rushing across the open ground with a force that nothing built by human hands could long withstand. And he had prepared, in secret, weapons of the old kind, the atomics that his family had carried down through the centuries and never used. And with these he meant to break open the very shield wall itself, to let the storm pour through the gap and fall upon the emperor's proud encampment. So it happened, on the day he had chosen, that the ground shook and the great rock rampart split and crumbled, and through the wound in the mountains the storm came howling down, blind and enormous and merciless, tearing away the shields and the aircraft and the ordered ranks of the imperial host. And out of that same storm, riding upon the backs of the great sandworms, the huge and ancient beasts they called Shai-Hulud, came the Fremen. They rode the worms as no other people had ever dared, standing upon their vast ribbed lengths, driving them forward through the very heart of the tempest, and where the worms passed the ground itself seemed to rise up in fury. The Sardaukar, who had never been broken, found themselves broken now, overwhelmed by a people who did not fear death, who moved through the storm as though it were their own breath, who fought with a savage and joyful certainty that no discipline could answer. The legions of the emperor, so proud and so sure, were scattered and swallowed and undone upon the open sand. Yet Paul knew that soldiers alone would not be enough to bend the throne of the universe. For behind the emperor stood the Spacing Guild, whose navigators guided every ship between the stars, and the guild depended utterly upon the spice, the melange that flowed only from Arrakis and from nowhere else in all the worlds of men. And so Paul held in his hand a threat greater than any army, a threat that even the guild in its cold and calculating power could not ignore. He let it be known that he possessed the means to destroy the spice utterly, to unmake the sacred substance in a burning that could never be reversed, to end forever the flow of melange, and with it the flow of ships between the stars, the very lifeblood of the empire and of trade and of civilization itself. It was a threat that could not be answered, a threat that placed the fate of 10,000 worlds in the palm of one young man standing on the sand, and against it the pride of the emperor and the greed of the guild and the ambition of the great houses all fell silent and helpless. And so Paul came before the fallen emperor in his shattered encampment, and the reckoning he had foreseen so many times unfolded at last. The old baron who had ruled the Harkonnens was already dead, undone within his own halls, and now the last champion of that cruel line stood forth to challenge Paul in single combat, a young man as fierce and as trained as Paul himself, and the two of them met blade to blade upon the floor of that ruined hall. It was a close and terrible thing, that duel, for the Harkonnen fought with hidden tricks and poisoned needles and the desperate cunning of a cornered beast, but in the end it was Paul who stood and his enemy who fell, and the last shadow of the house that had murdered his father was wiped away. Then there was nothing left to stand between Paul Atreides and the highest seat in all the worlds. The Emperor, stripped of his soldiers and his power and his pride, had no choice but to yield, and Paul took from him the throne of the known universe, the crown that ruled 1,000,000 worlds, the seat that no Atreides had ever thought to claim. To bind his victory into something the great houses could not easily undo, Paul took the Emperor's eldest daughter, the Princess Irulan, as his wife, so that his claim to the throne might carry the weight of the old line as well as the weight of his sword. It was a marriage of law and of state, a bond of politics and of careful design, and Paul entered into it with his eyes open to what it was and what it was not. For the wife of his heart, the one he truly loved, remained Chani, the Fremen woman of his dreams and his long desert years, and she would stay always the beloved at the center of his life, whatever titles and treaties surrounded her. The princess would hold the name of wife, and Chani would hold everything else, and Paul carried both truths within him as he took up the burden of the throne. And so, upon the broken sand of the world, where he had lost everything and found everything, the boy from the green ocean planet became the master of all the worlds of men, the desert people flooding out from the sea edges to hail him, the great storm settling at last, the dust drifting slowly down out of the calming air. The battle was over, and the reckoning was complete, and a kind of quiet return to the vast plain where so much had turned in a single day. Let that quiet come to you now, the slow settling of dust after a great wind, the long stillness after everything has been decided, the wide and peaceful hush that spreads across the cooling sand as the light softens and the day lets go, and let it carry you gently downward toward the deep and easy rest that waits for you now. When Paul Atreides took the throne of the known universe, he had already seen, long before it came, the terrible thing that his victory would set loose upon the stars. For years, in the deep visions granted him by the spice and by the strange awakening of his blood, he had watched a single fearful shape rising again and again across the futures. A shape he had tried in every way he could imagine to avoid, and yet which came anyway, no matter which path he chose. It was the shape of a holy war, a great burning that would carry his name and his faith out from the desert world and across the whole vast reach of settled space. A war fought in his name by people who loved him beyond all reason. And it was the one future he most dreaded, and it was the one he could not stop. The Fremen who had followed him out of the Sayaches did not see the war as he saw it. To them, he was the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, the promised one whose coming had been foretold across the generations, and now that promise had been fulfilled before their eyes. They had ridden the worms through the storm and broken the legions of the Emperor and set their leader upon the highest throne of all the worlds. And to them, this was not an ending, but a beginning. The first bright morning of a faith that would sweep outward and remake everything it touched. Their devotion was total, their certainty absolute, and their hunger to carry the truth they believed in out to every corner of the empire could not be quenched by any word or command. What Paul had become was larger than Paul himself, a legend that had taken on its own weight and its own motion, and even seated upon the throne of 1,000,000 worlds he found that he could not turn it aside. And so the ships went out, the great vessels of the guild carrying the warriors of the desert to world after world, and where they landed the war followed. The lords of the great houses, who had thought to resist the strange young emperor from the sand, found that they faced not an army only, but a faith, a people who did not fear death because they believed that death in the service of Muad'Dib was a doorway and not an ending. The old order of things, the careful balance of houses and guild and sisterhood that had held the empire in its slow and cautious equilibrium for so many centuries, cracked and broke and was swept away, and in its place rose the banner of the desert prophet, planted upon world after world after world. The cost of it was beyond counting. Across the long years of the war, whole populations were subdued and whole worlds were burned, and the dead were numbered not in thousands nor in millions, but in a tally so vast that the mind could not truly hold it. Billions of lives spent in the name of a man who had never wished for any of it. Cities that had stood for ages fell silent. Faiths that had endured for uncounted generations were swallowed up or bent to serve the new belief. The name of Muad'Dib became a word spoken in awe and in terror across the whole breadth of the settled stars, carried on the tongues of pilgrims and soldiers and the frightened survivors of conquered worlds, until there was no place left in all the empire where it was not known and not feared. And Paul, who had foreseen every step of it, who had walked in his visions through the corridors of the dead, and had seen the mountains of skulls his legend would raise, could only rule and mourn. He sat upon the throne he had won, the master of all the worlds of men, and he felt the terrible momentum of the thing he had become carrying him forward, whether he willed it or not. He had thought, in his younger days upon the sand, that a man with the power to see the future would surely have the power to shape it, to choose the gentlest of the paths laid out before him. But he had learned the hardest lesson of prescience, which was that seeing a thing does not always mean being able to prevent it, and that a man who becomes a symbol loses the power to command the meaning others pour into his name. He had become a vessel for the hopes and the fury of an entire people, and the tide of their devotion was greater than any single will, greater even than the will of the one they worshipped. There were moments, in the quiet hours between the councils and the reports and the endless business of empire, when the full weight of it settled upon him, and he grieved for the fire he had lit and could not put out. He grieved for the worlds he would never see made peaceful, for the lives poured out under his banner, for the gentle boy from the ocean planet who had wanted only to save his father and his house, and had ended by loosing a storm across the stars. He carried this grief quietly, as he carried so many things quietly, hidden behind the calm and measured face of the emperor, for he knew that to show it would change nothing, and that the war would go on burning whether he wept for it or not. He had become a prisoner of his own legend, seated at the very center of all power, and yet unable to bend the greatest force his life had set in motion. He had tried, in his younger days, to find some narrow path between the futures that would let him avoid this altogether, some slender road that led to victory without the burning that followed it. Night after night, in the deep spiced trances that opened time before him, he had searched the branching corridors of what might be, looking for the single turning that would spare the billions he could see dying under his banner. And night after night, he had come back with the same terrible knowledge that every road wide enough to save his house and his people led onward into the holy war. It was not that he had failed to see. It was that seeing had shown him no door he could bear to open in place of this one. And so he ruled, and the ruling was itself a kind of penance. He listened, and he judged, and he did what small good the vast machinery of his power would still allow, and behind it all he felt the current of the legend pulling ever onward, indifferent to his sorrow, hungry for more. Yet even in the midst of this terrible reign, Paul held to what remained human within him. He worked, in the ways that were left to him, to soften what he could not stop, to guide the tide where guiding was possible, to hold together some thread of mercy inside the vast machinery of conquest. He remembered Caladan and the rain and the sea and the honor his father had taught him, and the deep desert years when he had been simply a man among the Fremen, learning the ways of the sand. He remembered that beneath the god they worshipped there was still only a person, weary and grieving and bound, doing what little a person could do at the heart of something so much larger than himself. And that remembering was its own kind of quiet resistance, a small and stubborn keeping of the self against the vast and impersonal weight of the myth. So the years of the Holy War unrolled across the stars, and the empire of Muad'Dib spread and settled and hardened into its new shape, and Paul ruled over it all, powerful beyond any who had come before him, and yet caught fast in the very power he wielded. It is a heavy thing to hold in the mind, this vision of one man carrying the sorrow of a whole burning galaxy behind a calm and steady face. And you do not need to carry it with you into your rest. Let it grow distant now, the way the roar of a far storm grows distant when you are safe and warm and the door is shut against the night. Let the great fire fade to a faint and harmless glow at the edge of thought, and then let even that glow soften and dim, until there is only the quiet of your own breathing, slow and even and untroubled, drawing you gently down and down toward the deep and peaceful sleep that is waiting for you now. At the very center of all that Paul Atreides had become, beneath the crown and the conquered worlds and the burning tide of his legend, there remained one quiet and unchanging thing, and that thing was his love for Chani. She had come to him first in the dreams of his boyhood, long before he ever set foot upon the sand, the girl with the deep blue eyes whom he had seen again and again in the corridors of his sleeping visions. And when at last he found her among the Fremen of the deep desert, she had become the truest anchor of his life. Through all the years that followed, through the fall of his house and the long wandering and the terrible rise to power, she stayed beside him, his desert wife, the mother of his heart, the one person before whom he could set down for a little while the vast and lonely burden of being Muad'Dib. Their love was a quiet thing, all the more precious for the storm that surrounded it. In the great halls of the empire, amid the endless ceremony and the watchful eyes of courtiers and priests, Chani carried herself with the fierce and simple dignity of the desert, unimpressed by the trappings of a power she had helped to win, caring nothing for titles or thrones, caring only for the man who lived behind them. To the wider empire, Paul was married to the Princess Irulan, the daughter of the fallen emperor. But that was a marriage of law and of state, a bond of politics into which no love had ever entered, and both Paul and Chani understood exactly what it was and what it was not. The princess held the name and the public place of wife, and Chani held everything that mattered, the whole of Paul's heart, and she held it without jealousy and without fear, secure in a bond that no treaty could touch. Into this love, in time, there came the hope of children, and that hope was both a joy and a shadow, for Paul, in his prescient sight, had glimpsed the danger that lay along that path. There were enemies who worked in secret against him, even at the height of his power, plotters within his own court and beyond it, and among the weapons they turned against him was a terrible device of light, a burning that could strike at the eyes. In the course of these hidden struggles, Paul was struck by such a weapon, and by it he was blinded, the sight of his outward eyes taken from him forever. Yet here the strangeness of his nature revealed itself once more. For though his physical eyes were dark and dead, his inner sight, the deep prescient vision that the spice had opened in him, remained. He could walk the halls of his palace without stumbling, could reach for a thing and grasp it, could move among his people as though he still saw, because his prescience showed him each moment just before it came, laying the present out before his mind like a path already known. He was a blind man who saw, and a seeing man who was blind, and he lived within that strange doubled condition with a quiet and steady grace. And so it was that when Chani came at last to the time of her childbearing, Paul watched over her not with his lost eyes, but with the deeper and more terrible sight of his prescience. And that sight showed him what was coming, and he could not turn it aside. Chani carried not one child, but two, a pair of twins growing together within her, and the bearing of them was hard upon her, harder than either of them had let themselves believe. She had grown thin and worn through the long years at the heart of the empire, and the double burden of the children she carried drew upon a strength that had already given so much. Paul stayed near her through it all, holding within himself the dreadful knowledge of what the visions had shown, saying nothing of it, only being present, only loving her in the quiet way that had always been theirs. Through the long years of their life together, before this final ordeal, the two of them had carved out small islands of peace amid the storm of empire. In the quiet of their private rooms, away from the courtiers and the priests and the endless demands of the throne, they had spoken as they had spoken in the Sietch, plainly and without pretense, two people who had walked out of the desert together and remembered what they had been before the world had made him a god. Chani had never let him forget the human being beneath the legend, had never bowed to the myth as others bowed, had loved the man and not the crown. And in that steady and unawed devotion, Paul had found the one true rest that his life allowed him. She had been his water in a dry land, the still center around which all the turning of the empire revolved, and he had known, with the terrible certainty of his prescience, how much of himself would go dark when she was gone. The twins were born, a son and a daughter, and they were given the names Leto and Ghanima, the boy named for the grandfather who had fallen on the sand of Arrakis, the girl bearing a name of the desert. They were strange and knowing children even in their first hours, touched as their Aunt Alia had been touched, awake within themselves in a way that ordinary infants are not, carrying already the deep inheritance of their line. But even as these two new lives came into the world, the life that had brought them forth was slipping away. Chani, worn beyond her strength by the long ordeal, did not survive the birth of her children. She gave them into the world and gave her own life in the giving, and passed out of Paul's reach in the very hour that his son and his daughter drew their first breath. And so Paul stood, blind and yet seeing, at the meeting place of the deepest joy and the deepest grief that his life had ever brought him. In his arms were the twins, the living children of the woman he had loved beyond all else, warm and small and new, carrying the future within them. And gone from him forever was Chani herself, the one true companion of his heart, the desert woman who had walked beside him from the Sietch to the throne of the universe. He had foreseen this loss in his visions long ago, had walked toward it with the terrible foreknowledge that prescience laid upon him, and yet no amount of seeing had made the arrival of it any less heavy. He held his grief as he had learned to hold all things, quietly and deeply, without breaking, and he held his children close against that grief, the two small lives that were all that remained to him of the love he had lost. There was a great stillness in him then, the stillness of a man who has been given everything and has lost the one thing that made the everything worth having. All the power of the empire, all the worlds that bowed to his name, all the vast machinery of his reign. None of it could give him back the woman who had died, bringing his children into the world. And yet the children themselves were there, breathing, alive, needing him. And in them, there was a thread of hope, stretched forward into the years he could not yet fully see. He gathered them to him, the blind emperor, with his seeing heart, and he carried within himself both the weight of what was lost and the fragile promise of what remained, holding them both together in the deep quiet of his sorrow. Let that quiet come to you now, gently, the way evening comes to a still house. There is a tenderness even in the deepest grief, a softness at the center of loss. And you may let that softness settle over you like a warm and familiar blanket drawn up in the dark. Let the sorrow of it grow gentle and far away, no longer sharp, only a quiet ache that fades and fades as the mind lets go. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and easy. Let each small worry loosen its hold and drift downward into the soft dark until there is only warmth and stillness and the slow, sure rhythm of rest carrying you gently down towards sleep. After the loss of Chani, a great weariness settled upon Paul Atreides, a weariness deeper than any that battle or exile had ever brought him. He had reached the very summit of all earthly power, the throne of 1,000,000 worlds, the worship of an entire faith, and he had found at that summit only ash and silence where his heart had been. The woman he loved was gone. His children were born and safe, watched over by those he trusted. The empire ran on beneath him with its own terrible momentum, no longer needing his hand to guide it. The machinery of his reign grinding forward whether he willed it or not. And the visions that had once opened the future to him now showed him only paths he did not wish to walk. Corridors of power and prophecy that led on and on into a distance he no longer had the heart to travel. He had become, at the last, a man imprisoned by everything he had won, and he began to long, quietly and deeply, for a way out. There was, among the Fremen who had made him what he was, an old and gentle custom that reached back into the oldest days of their life upon the sand. It was their way, when one of their people was struck blind, to give that person to the desert. A blind one, in the harsh arithmetic of the Sietch, could no longer contribute to the survival of the tribe, could no longer hunt or fight or carry water, and so by ancient and unquestioned tradition, the blind were sent out alone into the open dunes, given over to Shai-Hulud, given back to the sand from which all life on Arrakis was said to come. It was not cruelty in the eyes of the Fremen, but a kind of solemn mercy, a returning of the self to the deep desert and to the God that lived beneath it, a passing that carried its own quiet dignity. Paul was blind. His outward eyes had been dark for a long while now, and though his prescient sight had let him move among his people as though he still saw, that inner vision had at last begun to fail him too, or perhaps he had simply grown unwilling to lean upon it any longer. In the eyes of the Fremen, and in the eyes of the ancient law that governed the deep desert, he was a blind man, and a blind man belonged to the sand. And Paul, weary of empire, weary of prophecy, weary of being a god to people who could not see the human grief he carried, looked upon that old custom and found in it the doorway he had been longing for. He could not simply set down the crown, for the empire would not release him and the faith would not let him go, but the desert would take him, quietly and without question, in the way it had always taken its blind, and in that taking he might at last become free. And so, one evening, without ceremony and without farewell to the assembled powers of his empire, Paul Atreides rose from the throne of the known universe and walked away from it. He passed out through the halls of his palace, the halls where he had ruled and grieved, And he went out through the edges of the city that had grown up around his power, out past the last of the lights and the last of the walls, out to where the ordered world of men gave way to the great open sea of the dunes. He did not take guards, nor guides, nor any of the vast apparatus that had surrounded him for so long. He went as the blind Fremen had always gone, alone, on foot, with nothing, giving himself to the desert as his adopted people had given so many before him. Behind him, he left everything. He left the throne and the crown and the empire that bowed to his name. He left the faith that worshipped him and the war that burned in his honor across the stars. He left his son and his daughter, the twins Leto and Ganima, to grow up carrying the strange inheritance of their blood and the long shadow of their father, to become in time whatever the future would make of them. He left the princess who held the name of wife and the sister who had walked beside him through so much, and all the loyal ones who had followed him from the Sietches to the seat of power. He left the whole vast structure of his life, the myth and the might of Muad'Dib, standing behind him in the lighted city, and he walked out alone into the dark. The desert received him as it had received him once before, long ago, when he had fled into it as a hunted boy, and it had become the crucible that remade him. But this time, there was no flight in his steps and no fear in his heart, only a deep and final calm. He walked out across the cooling sand beneath the wide and ancient stars, the sand he had come to love above all the green worlds of his birth, the sand that had given him everything and taken everything, and he let it close around him. What became of him out there in the open dunes, no one truly knew. The Fremen, who had given so many of their blind to the desert, did not follow and did not search, for that was not their way. He simply walked out into the vastness and did not return, and the sand kept its silence about him as it had kept its silence about all the others it had taken across the long ages. As he walked, the noise of the empire fell away behind him, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the soft hiss of sand moving beneath his feet and the vast quiet of the open night. He no longer needed to see with his eyes, for he had never truly seen with them in these last years, and now even the inner vision seemed to grow gentle and dim, releasing its hold, letting the future close back into mystery. There was a great relief in that, in the not knowing, in the surrender of the burden of prophecy that had weighed upon him since the day he first tasted the fullness of the spice. He was only a man again, walking upon the sand, tired and grieving and free, and the desert did not ask him to be anything more. Whether one of the great worms found him, or whether he simply lay down at last beneath the stars and let the desert take him in its own slow and patient way, no story ever told for certain, and perhaps it was better so. The manner of his going mattered less than the going itself, the quiet choosing of it. And in that vanishing, Paul Atreides passed at last out of the reach of history and into the country of legend. A man may be killed and remembered as a man who died, but a man who walks alone into the desert and is never seen again becomes something else. Something that cannot be pinned down or laid to rest. A figure who slips free of the ordinary weight of endings and lives on in story and in whispered hope. The people who had worshipped him would tell of his going for generations, and in their telling he would never quite be dead, only gone, only walking still somewhere out beyond the last dune, become one with the sand and the worm and the deep abiding spirit of the world he had ruled and loved. The boy from the green ocean planet, the Duke's son, the Mentat, the swordsman, the fugitive, the rider of worms, the emperor of a million worlds, laid all of it down and walked quietly into the open desert, and the desert took him gently in, and he was gone. There is a great peace in that image, the lone figure walking away into the wide dark, unburdened at last, free of the crown and the grief and the terrible weight of what he had been. Let that peace settle over you now, softly and completely. Let the cares of the day walk out into the desert too, growing smaller and fainter with every step, until they are lost beyond the last dune and cannot trouble you anymore. Let the wide and quiet dark spread over everything, warm and endless and kind, and let yourself sink into it the way the sand receives the falling evening, without effort and without fear, drifting slowly and gently down into deep and untroubled sleep. When the sand had closed over the last of his footprints, and the man who had been Paul Atreides was gone from the sight of all who knew him, what remained was everything he had left behind, and that inheritance was vast and strange and heavy with the future. For a single life, begun in the rain on a green ocean world and ended in silence upon the open dunes, had reached out and touched every corner of the settled stars, and the shape of what he left would go on unfolding for generations after his walking away. He had been a boy of Caladan, and he had become a god of the desert, and the space between those two things held a whole world of consequence that did not end when he did. He left, first and most tenderly, his children, the twins Leto and Ganima, born in the same hour that their mother was lost, grew now without the father who had carried them out of his grief, and they carried within them the deep and doubled inheritance of their line, the blood of the Atreides and the strangeness of the desert and the awakened sight that had marked their father and their aunt before them. They were children unlike other children, knowing things they had never been taught, awake within themselves in ways that frightened those who tended them, and in them lay coiled the seeds of all that was yet to come. For the story of the desert world did not end with Paul, but passed onward into these two small and knowing lives, and through them toward a distant and difficult purpose that their father had glimpsed in his visions and had not been able to bring about himself. There was a path stretching far into the future, a long and narrow road that Paul had seen and had turned away from at the last, too weary and too grief-worn to walk it, and it would fall in time to his son to take up that terrible burden, the golden path that led through darkness toward the far survival of humankind. But that was a tale for other nights, and it lay still in the future, quiet and waiting, when Paul walked into the sand. He left, too, an empire that bore his name and a faith that had grown up around his memory. The throne of the known universe had passed through his hands and been changed forever by his passing, and the old order that had ruled for so many centuries would never be restored to what it had been. Across 1,000,000 worlds, the name of Muad'Dib was spoken with awe and with reverence, woven now into the deep fabric of belief, a legend that had outgrown the man and would outlast him by ages. The war he had loosed and mourned had remade the map of the settled stars, and the religion born on the sand of Arrakis had spread to every horizon, so that there was no place left where his story was not known, and no people left untouched by the storm his life had raised. He had wished, in the quiet of his heart, that it might have been otherwise, that the fire might have burned less fiercely, and the cost been less terrible. But a life lived at the scale of his could not help but leave a shadow the size of the whole sky, and that shadow lay now across everything. There was, in the shape of everything he left behind, a strange and quiet symmetry, for the boy who had been born into one great inheritance had died leaving another, far vaster than the first. He had come into the world as the heir of a single house, one noble line among many, bound to a green ocean world, and to the honor of his father. He went out of it as the fountainhead of a faith, the founder of a dynasty, the hinge upon which the whole history of humankind had turned. Between those 2 points lay all the striving of his life, and the measure of it was written now across the stars, in ways no single mind could fully hold. The sisterhood that had bred toward him for uncounted generations had gotten more than they had planned and could no longer control what they had made. The guild that had ruled the space between worlds now depended upon his heirs. The great houses that had once looked down upon a young duke from Caladan now bowed to the children of his blood. Everything had shifted around the axis of his single life, and nothing would ever settle back into what it had been. And beneath all of it, beneath the empire and the faith and the golden path yet to come, there remained the simple and human truth of the life itself, the thread that had run from beginning to end. A child had been born beneath a gray and gentle sky, loved by a father who ruled with honor and a mother who kept a forbidden promise. A boy had learned the secret disciplines of the mind and the body, had endured the test of pain and passed through it into something more, had been shaped by teachers who loved him and had lost the only home he had ever known. A young man had been cast out into the desert to die, and had instead found there a people, a name, a love, and a destiny larger than he had ever wished. He had ridden the great worms and taken the sacred trance and woken with the future spread open before him. He had risen from a hunted fugitive to the master of all the worlds, had won and mourned and loved and grieved, and had laid it all down at the last and walked quietly away. From the first breath to the final step, it had been one whole human life. And now it was complete, and the sand was settling softly over all of it. There is a great and gentle peace in the completion of a life fully told, in following it all the way from its tender beginning to its quiet end, and then letting it come to rest. Everything that troubled him is over now. Every trial he faced is finished, every battle stilled, every grief laid down. The storms have passed, the worms swim slow and deep beneath the dunes, and the desert lies wide and calm beneath the ancient stars, keeping its long silence over the one it took gently in. The empire he left will run its course, and the children he left will find their way, and the legend he became will go on being told on quiet nights like this one. But for now, in this moment, there is only the settling sand and the long peace of the ending. You have followed him the whole way, from the sea castle in the rain to the last lonely walk into the dunes, and now there is nothing left for you to hold. Let it all settle, the way dust settles on a still evening, the way sand settles over a quiet place and smooths itself and grows calm. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to carry any of it forward. Let each bright and difficult thing sink slowly away from you, growing softer and fainter until only stillness remains. Let the wide desert of the mind grow quiet and dark and warm. Let your breathing slow and lengthen. Let your body grow heavy and easy. Let the last small weight of the day dissolve like heat shimmer fading from the cooling dunes. There is nothing here to fear and nothing left to do. The story is finished, and it has folded itself back into the sand, and you may let go of it entirely now, the way the desert lets go of the day. Let the deep and gentle dark draw you softly down, and let the long, kind peace of rest fold quietly over you, warm and endless and untroubled, carrying you all the way down into sleep. And so we come, softly, to the end of one whole life. Tonight we followed Paul Atreides from his very first breath to his last quiet step into the sand. We began on the green ocean world of Caladan, in the old stone castle of his family, where a duke ruled with honor and a Bene Gesserit mother kept a secret promise, and a watchful boy grew up beneath the rain, already dreaming of a desert he had never seen. We watched him learn the hidden disciplines of his mother, the stillness of breath and muscle, the reading of voice and gesture. We watched him endure the test of the box and the poisoned needle at his throat and pass through pain into something more. We watched his mind sharpened into a mentat's clear instrument and his body trained by the warrior Gurney and the swordmaster Duncan. We followed him across the black gulf of space to the burning world of Arrakis, and through the terrible night when his house was betrayed and his father fell, and mother and son were cast out to die among the dunes. We walked with him into the deep desert and into the hidden warrens of the Fremen, where he found a people, a name, and the girl of his dreams. We watched him learn the ways of the sand and ride the great worm at last and take the sacred water of life and wake transformed, his sight opened wide across time. We watched a fugitive become Muad'Dib and a scattered desert people become an army, and the great emperor and his legions fall upon the sand. We saw him take the throne of the known universe and mourn the holy fire that carried his name across the stars, a fire he could not stop. We held the quiet center of it all, his love for Chani, and the twins born as she was lost, and the grief he carried behind his blinded, seeing eyes. And at the end, we watched him lay down his crown and walk alone into the open desert, out of the reach of history, into legend and into the sand he loved, leaving his children and his long shadow behind him. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink slowly away from you, down through still, dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are warm. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you now. Let your breathing slow and lengthen. Let the last of the day dissolve like heat shimmer fading from the evening dunes until there is only the soft dark and the quiet weight of rest. Good night. Whenever you are ready for another long, gentle tale to carry you towards sleep, we will be here waiting. And there are many more nights and many more stories still to come.